What quiet forces shaped the land long before any human carved stone? Long before the first villages appeared along the Gulf Coast, the land breathed in slow geological rhythms. This was a world shaped less by human hands and more by water, soil, and time itself. Warm winds drifted in from the Gulf of Mexico, carrying moisture inland until it fell as gentle rain, feeding an environment both lush and unpredictable. In this landscape, where rivers moved like ancient serpents and forests pressed close to the water's edge, the earliest foundations of Mesoamerican life began to take form. The Gulf Coast of present-day Veracruz and Tabasco lay within a broad tropical corridor. Temperatures remained warm year-round, and humidity collected in the canopy, turning the air soft and heavy. Beneath that canopy stretched wetlands alive with movement. The murmur of frogs at twilight, the slow sway of reeds in the tides, and the distant calls of herons that settled along the estuaries. Yet even amid the stillness, the land was always shifting. Seasonal floods poured fresh sediments across the floodplains, renewing the soil with nutrients washed down from inland foothills. Each year, this cycle repeated, quiet, reliable, and generous. One of the calm discoveries of this landscape was its clay. Rich deposits, formed from river erosion and slow sedimentation, collected along low marshy areas. These clays would one day become the material of early figurines, pottery, and architecture. But here, in this earliest chapter, they slept beneath the waterlogged earth, waiting for human hands that had not yet arrived. It is in these quiet pockets of potential that the story of the Olmecs begins, not with kings or monuments, but with the land itself offering its gifts. Along the outer edges of the floodplains, dense forests grew in layered complexity. Ceiba trees stretched high above the canopy, their roots twisting like natural pillars into the earth. Beneath them lived a world of palms, ferns, and fruit-bearing shrubs that supported early animal populations. Tapirs and deer moved cautiously through the underbrush, while jaguars carved silent paths through the shadows. These creatures shaped the ecological rhythm long before humans learned to read the patterns, each species part of a delicate chain that sustained life across the region. Further toward the coastline, mangrove forests anchored themselves in brackish waters where freshwater rivers met the sea. Their tangled roots formed living walls, habitats for fish, crustaceans, and migrating birds. At night, the mangroves hummed with insects and small movements concealed beneath the dark water. These coastal ecosystems were more than just boundaries. They were protective buffers against storms and rising tides. When ancient hurricanes swept in from the Gulf, it was the mangroves that absorbed the impact, reducing erosion and reshaping the shoreline in subtle ways. Yet nature's work was not limited to water and vegetation. Beneath the surface, tectonic forces pushed at the land from below. The region sat at the meeting point of shifting plates, creating gentle uplifts and periodic volcanic activity in the distant highlands. Though the Gulf Coast itself was not volcanic, the slow rumbling of the earth inland created far-reaching effects. Ash from highland eruptions drifted across the lowlands, enriching the soil over centuries. This quiet geological exchange, mountain to plain, fire to field, laid the foundation for agricultural abundance long before the first maize seeds were planted. As sea levels gradually rose after the last ice age, the coastline advanced inland. Ancient settlements that once stood miles from the water found themselves nearer the coast with each passing millennium. Rivers, too, changed their paths, branching and rebranching across the plains. These slow migrations created oxbow lakes and wetlands, opening new habitats for fish and waterfowl. For early human groups, these transformations offered both challenge and opportunity. Changing landscapes demanded adaptability, yet they also produced fertile ground for settlement. Another calm discovery emerges here. The land was not simply a backdrop for human life. It was a teacher. Seasonal floods taught patience and memory. Rich soils taught foresight. Forests taught movement and awareness. In this sense, the Gulf Coast acted as an early guide, shaping the people who would one day rise as the Olmecs. When humans finally arrived, they did not conquer this terrain. They learned to listen to it. By the time small foraging groups began moving along the river corridors, The region had established a powerful ecological rhythm. Waterways provided routes for travel and resources for survival. Floodplain soils offered reliable harvests for early cultivators. Clay beds, abundant and workable, would soon supply the first artistic expressions of the region, symbols of a growing cultural identity. Every element of the landscape contributed to an environment in which complexity could flourish. This chapter of quiet origins reminds us that civilizations rarely emerge from sudden bursts of innovation. Instead, they rise out of landscapes that nurture, challenge, and inspire human imagination. Here, on the Gulf Coast, the stage was set long before the first monument at San Lorenzo or the first colossal head at La Venta. Nature had already prepared its canvas. Rivers had carved their lines, forests had woven their shadows, and floodplains had laid their rich foundation. As we step back from this prehistoric world, the scene holds a sense of calm continuity. Nothing here moves quickly. Not the rivers, not the forests, not the slow uplift of the land. Yet, in these measured rhythms, we can already sense the opening notes of a civilization to come. As rivers braided across the lowlands, small human groups began to follow their rhythms, and the first steps toward Olmec culture quietly took shape. How did wandering families become the ancestors of a monumental civilization? Long before the first earthen mounds or carved stones marked the Gulf Coast, small human groups walked its riverbanks with the quiet confidence of people deeply attuned to the land. These were the archaic foragers, descendants of the Paleo-Indian hunters who had once tracked great mammals across the continent. By the time they reached what is now Veracruz and Tabasco, the megafauna had disappeared, leaving behind a new world of subtler challenges and gentler opportunities. In this humid, fertile environment, humans found not a place of harsh survival, but a landscape that invited patient observation and steady adaptation. Their lives unfolded in seasonal rhythms. Families moved along well-known routes that followed rivers, lagoons, and forests rich with edible plants. They carried woven baskets, stone blades, and netting fashioned from fibers stripped from wild vines. These tools were simple but effective extensions of hands that had learned to work with the land rather than against it. Children walked close to their parents, learning the shapes of leaves and the paths of small animals, gradually memorizing an encyclopedia of local knowledge that had no written form but lived vividly in the mind. Fishing became one of their earliest and most consistent skills. At dawn, when river mist lingered above the water, foragers cast nets weighted with small stones. The nets spread in a gentle arc before sinking slowly, capturing fish that darted near the shallows. Shellfish beds revealed themselves at low tide, offering another reliable source of nourishment. These activities were quiet and unhurried, a harmony between people and the waterways that sustained them. It was along these riverbanks that some of the first semi-permanent camps appeared, not as a grand shift, but as a gradual comfort with returning to the same familiar places. One calm discovery of this period lies in the seeds they began to save. As families gathered wild squash or chili peppers, they noticed that plants growing near old camps tended to produce larger or more predictable fruits. This observation, simple, almost incidental, marked the early steps toward horticulture. People began to plant seeds near their shelters, watching which varieties thrived in sunlight or shade. It was not yet agriculture in the full sense, but it was a gentle negotiation with the land, a recognition that humans could influence growth without understanding the full science behind it. Over generations, these experiments expanded. Squash became one of the first cultivated plants, valued not only for its flesh but for its durable rind, which could be dried and used as a container. Manioc, a root crop well suited to tropical soils, followed. Its cultivation required patience and careful processing, teaching early settlers the importance of shared knowledge and communal labor. Chili peppers, small but potent, added flavor to meals and slowly integrated into the culinary traditions of the region. Each of these plants signaled a subtle shift, food sourced not only from the wild but also from intentional care. As diets diversified, camps grew more stable. Families returned to the same clearings each year, expanding them slightly, rebuilding hearths, and adding new shelters woven from palm fronds and wooden stakes. The forest still provided most of their daily needs, but now the land near the camps began to hold meaning. Places where ancestors had lived, where harvests had first taken root, where children were born. In this intimacy with place, we see the earliest whispers of settlement. Stone tools evolved alongside these changes. Foragers crafted small, finely shaped projectile points suited for hunting deer and smaller game. Grinding stones appeared, used to process seeds and roots into softer, more digestible forms. These tools, scattered across archaeological sites, speak to a quiet ingenuity, people responding to their environment with steady refinement rather than sudden leaps. Social life grew richer as well. Even small camps contained a sense of community, with tasks divided according to skill and experience. Elders remembered the best fishing seasons, while younger adults watched the cycles of the rivers and advised when to move inland or toward the coast. Children learned through imitation, playing with miniature nets or helping gather firewood. These early groups lived without the hierarchies that would later define Olmec society, but they possessed the foundational bonds of cooperation that all civilizations require. Another calm discovery arises in the way these communities balanced mobility with attachment. They were not fully nomadic, nor were they sedentary. Instead, they lived in a shifting pattern of return, moving with the seasons but circling back to the same favored sites. This rhythm allowed them to experiment with cultivating plants without giving up the freedom of foraging. It was a transitional mode of life, delicate but sustainable, and remarkably well suited to the ecological richness of the Gulf Coast. As time passed, these repeated returns strengthened the connection between people and land. Pathways between camps grew more defined, revealing early social networks. Canoes carved from hollow logs allowed families to travel along rivers with greater ease, linking distant groups and encouraging the exchange of knowledge. When one camp discovered a more productive route or a new technique for weaving nets, the innovation gradually spread along these waterways, carried by conversations around shared fires. The world of the archaic foragers was humble, yet full of quiet significance. In their daily routines, fishing, gathering, planting, teaching, lay the seeds of the monumental culture to come. They did not know that their careful observations of rivers and plants would one day support the ceremonial centers of San Lorenzo and La Venta. They lived simply, responding to the land with respect, curiosity, and patience. And yet, as we listen closely, we can hear in their footsteps the earliest rhythms of Olmec society. These wandering families did not build colossal heads or carve jade into sacred forms, but they shaped the foundation upon which such achievements would stand. Their knowledge, accumulated slowly, shared freely, and rooted in experience, became the quiet inheritance of the people who followed. With each passing generation, the desire for steadier food sources grew stronger, guiding the first settlers toward a more permanent relationship with the land. The shift from wandering forager camps to the first agricultural settlements on the Gulf Coast was neither sudden nor dramatic. It unfolded quietly, over countless seasons, as families began to trust the soil beneath their feet. What began as small experiments, seeds dropped near hearths, plants observed on return visits, gradually matured into a relationship that would transform their world. In these moments of gentle experimentation, we witnessed the birth of early farming, and with it, the first hints of the villages that would one day cradle the Olmec civilization. Maize was at the center of this transformation. Its earliest forms were simple, a grass known as teosinte, with kernels small and encased in hard shells. But generations of selective gathering and replanting shaped it into something more nourishing. Families noticed which ears held more seeds, which plants grew taller, and which stalks endured the humid climate of the Gulf Coast. These observations, passed quietly from mother to child, gradually turned maize into a dependable crop. It was one of humanity's great agricultural achievements, unfolding not in a single revelation but in a series of small, attentive choices. Alongside maize, beans and squash formed a complementary trio, a combination later known as the Three Sisters. Together, they enriched the soil, strengthened each other's growth, and provided a balanced diet that supported larger, healthier populations. In the warm lowlands, these crops thrived. Fields expanded slowly outward from campsites, carved into the edges of forests or planted on higher ground, where seasonal floods would not wash them away. Over time, the reliance on cultivated plants grew, creating periods of predictable abundance that changed how families planned their lives. One calm discovery of this era lies in the emergence of shared spaces. As harvests improved, families began to store their surplus in communal pits lined with clay or woven matting. These storage areas served not only practical needs but also nurtured a sense of cooperation. The presence of shared food encouraged longer stays in one place. It also provided security during lean seasons, reinforcing the bonds that held the early villages together. What had once been temporary shelters evolved into clusters of homes where people lived not just for a season, but for years. With dependable harvests came new responsibilities. The early Gulf Coast villagers learned the rhythms of planting and maintenance. Fields needed clearing each year, irrigation channels required attention, and crops demanded constant care. These tasks were too large for any single household, and so the first communal labor patterns emerged. Families worked together to dig channels that guided water toward their fields, a modest but meaningful form of irrigation that hinted at future engineering feats. Cooperation became a way of life, linking neighbors through shared goals and shared labor. Rituals also grew from this agricultural stability. People began to honor the elements that governed their harvests: the sun that warmed the earth, the rains that softened the soil, and the earth itself, which held the seeds of life beneath its surface. The earliest ceremonies were simple: offerings of kernels, shaped clay figurines buried in the ground, or songs sung at planting time. These rituals reflected gratitude and hope, acknowledging forces larger than the community but intimately connected to their survival. Though humble, they represent the earliest spiritual roots of the later Olmec religious worldview. As villages took shape, their physical structure mirrored the values of cooperation and continuity. Houses made from wooden poles and thatched roofs were arranged around small open spaces where families gathered to cook, craft, and discuss daily tasks. These plazas, though modest, formed the earliest social centers of the region. Children played near drying racks filled with maize, elders prepared tools, and potters shaped vessels that carried water from nearby rivers. The village was becoming more than a place, it was a shared identity. Craft specialization emerged slowly. With food more secure, not everyone needed to spend their days tending crops. Some individuals devoted more time to weaving, pottery, or tool-making. Others became skilled in identifying fertile soils, predicting rain patterns, or crafting fishing gear that supplemented the community's diet. This subtle diversification laid the groundwork for the more complex social roles that would later define Olmec society. Trade networks also began to form during this time. Villages exchanged foods, fibers, and tools with neighboring groups. These interactions encouraged new ideas and strengthened connections across the Gulf Coast. Knowledge traveled along these paths as easily as goods. A better grinding stone design, a new planting technique, or an improved method for storing food could spread from village to village, weaving a quiet but expansive web of innovation. Community gatherings became more common. During harvest festivals or shared rituals, people gathered to reaffirm their ties, share food, and celebrate the seasons. These gatherings deepened the sense of belonging, reinforcing the idea that the village was stronger than the sum of its households. The seeds of social cohesion, essential to any future civilization, were firmly rooted in this era. By now, the land itself had become part of their story. Fields that had once been carved from forest edges were tended year after year, each season adding layers of memory. Footpaths connected homes to fields and fields to rivers, while communal spaces grew more defined with each generation. The transformation from mobile foraging groups to settled villagers was complete, not through grand decisions, but through countless small acts of cultivation, cooperation, and care. These early agricultural communities did not yet display the monumental stonework or intricate art that would later define the Olmecs. But they had created something equally powerful: stability. In the comfort of predictable harvests and shared labor, population grew. Families expanded, children lived longer, and the community gained the strength to imagine beyond daily survival. And from these simple villages arose the earliest expressions of what we now call the Olmec world, the foundations upon which a civilization would soon begin to rise. When does a people become a civilization? There is no single moment when the Olmecs suddenly emerged from the forests of the Gulf Coast fully formed. Instead, their identity began as a quiet convergence, an accumulation of shared symbols, styles, beliefs, and ways of living that slowly gathered weight over centuries. Archaeology gives us glimpses of this transition, like scattered constellations across the landscape. Jade masks with serene expressions, figurines of infants with rounded faces, early ceremonial platforms raised above the earth. These are not the works of a single generation, but of many, each contributing a piece to what would become one of the earliest civilizations of the Americas. By around 1600 BCE, the small agricultural villages of Veracruz and Tabasco had grown into communities with increasing social complexity. Their households were larger, their storage systems more sophisticated, and their rituals more organized. With stability came the capacity to invest time and energy into art, ceremony, and craftsmanship, activities that reveal the earliest signs of a distinct cultural identity. The Gulf Coast, once a landscape of rivers, fields, and scattered hamlets, was beginning to echo with shared meanings. One of the first clear markers of Olmec identity appears in their art. Archaeologists find small, carefully sculpted figurines with infant-like faces, rounded cheeks, downturned lips, and an expression that feels both serene and mysterious. These baby-face figurines suggest a symbolic world centered on birth, renewal, and perhaps sacred ancestry. Their features were too consistent to be accidental. They reflect a shared aesthetic sensibility that had spread across multiple communities. In them, we see not only artistic talent but a common language of symbolism. Jade, too, played a central role. Though the Gulf Coast itself lacked natural jade deposits, Olmec artisans developed an early mastery of the material. They traded far into the highlands of Guatemala to obtain the stone, valuing it for its luminous green hues and association with life, water, and vitality. The earliest jade masks, with their smooth surfaces and stylized features, suggest a culture deeply invested in ritual and transformation. These masks were not worn. They were offerings or ritual objects, representing ancestors, deities, or states of being that transcended ordinary life. A calm discovery lies in the way these artistic elements reveal a worldview taking shape. Across the region, symbols repeat: the cleft-headed infant, the jaguar-human hybrid, and the swirling motifs that seem to represent wind, breath, or divine essence. These images are not random. They form a constellation of beliefs connected to fertility, rain, animal spirits, and the cycles of nature. In these motifs, we begin to glimpse the philosophical foundations of the Olmecs, their understanding of the world as both physical and spiritual, shaped by forces that flowed through humans, animals, and landscape alike. Another defining feature of early Olmec identity emerges in architecture. Small villages began to construct modest ceremonial mounds, raised platforms built from earth, clay, and gravel. These were not the monumental pyramids of later cultures, but they signified something revolutionary: the idea of a designated ceremonial space, distinct from daily life. By raising platforms above the natural ground level, the early Olmecs created a physical boundary between the sacred and the ordinary. These structures reveal a growing sense of shared ritual practice and the early presence of leadership that could direct communal labor. The development of these ceremonial spaces marked a societal shift. Villages were no longer just clusters of households. They now possessed centers for gatherings, rituals, and leadership. The people who guided these activities, ritual specialists, elders, or early chiefs, began to hold symbolic power. Their authority was not based solely on physical strength or age, but on their ability to interpret signs, guide rituals, and perhaps mediate between the human world and the unseen forces believed to govern it. This emerging hierarchy, subtle yet significant, hints at the social structure that would soon define the Olmec heartland. Trade amplified this identity further. Communities exchanged pottery styles, pigments, and precious stones along networks that stretched across hundreds of miles. Through these exchanges, ideas traveled as easily as goods. A vessel with a particular carved pattern might influence the artisans of a distant village. An innovative method of shaping stone could spread across the region in a generation. Over time, these links strengthened, weaving the Gulf Coast communities into a shared cultural fabric distinct enough for archaeologists to later name it Olmec. But identity is not built by objects alone. It is also felt in stories. Though the Olmecs left no written texts, their symbols speak of myths that shaped their imaginations. The recurring jaguar motif, for example, suggests a belief in powerful animal helpers or shapeshifters. These hybrid forms, part human, part feline, may represent shamans, ancestors, or forces of nature. They reflect a worldview in which boundaries between species, realms, and states of being were permeable. This spiritual flexibility fostered a culture rich in symbolism and open to multiple interpretations of the world. Another calm discovery lies in the alignment of ceremonial spaces with landscape features, rivers, hills, and possibly celestial bodies. Even the earliest Olmec sites show attention to orientation and spatial order. These choices reveal a people beginning to conceptualize their environment as a sacred map, not just a backdrop for daily life, but an active participant in their spiritual and social narratives. By this time, a recognizable Olmec identity had begun to emerge, defined by its art, rituals, symbols, and the increasing complexity of its social structures. The world of the Gulf Coast was no longer a collection of independent villages. It was becoming a cultural region with shared aesthetics, shared beliefs, and a shared sense of meaning. Archaeologists describe this as the moment when the Olmecs become visible, not because they suddenly appear, but because their cultural fingerprint becomes unmistakable. As this identity crystallized, it laid the groundwork for something even greater. Ideas that had taken shape in clay, stone, and ceremony would soon be translated into architecture on a monumental scale. As identity took shape, the first great centers began to rise. What compelled the Olmecs to reshape an entire plateau? San Lorenzo was more than a village. It was a vision made of earth, stone, and human effort. Long before the grand cities of Mesoamerica arose, the Olmecs took the gentle, deliberate step of transforming a low plateau into a monumental center of life and ritual. Hills were leveled, terraces built, and clay-packed platforms raised above the flood-prone plains. The effect was subtle yet profound. A landscape carefully engineered to meet both practical needs and spiritual ambitions, a stage upon which the first organized Olmec society would unfold. The engineering of San Lorenzo reveals a people deeply attuned to their environment. Drainage canals channeled seasonal rains, protecting dwellings and plazas from inundation. Earthen terraces stabilized the plateau, creating distinct levels for homes, ceremonial spaces, and public gatherings. Though modest in scale compared to later pyramids, these terraces were feats of labor coordination, requiring careful planning, shared effort, and an understanding of materials. They speak of a society capable of long-term vision, of shaping the land not out of conquest, but in harmony with its rhythms. Walking through the imagined spaces of San Lorenzo, one encounters early monumental sculpture. The colossal heads carved from basalt, some weighing several tons. These immense portraits, with their serene but commanding expressions, likely represented rulers or ancestors. Transported from distant highland quarries, the stones were moved over rivers and through forests, an extraordinary endeavor that demonstrates not just technical skill, but communal commitment. Each head anchors the plaza it faces, creating a tangible sense of leadership, presence, and identity that would resonate across generations. Alongside the colossal heads, Other basalt monuments and figurines hint at ritual and religious life. Platforms and plazas served as stages for ceremonies tied to seasonal cycles, fertility, and water management. Small altars, carved stele, and symbolic carvings suggest that spiritual observance was inseparable from social and political order. By organizing labor around these projects, the Olmecs were establishing not just physical infrastructure, but also a moral and cultural framework, binding community members through shared purpose. Residences at San Lorenzo reflect an emerging social hierarchy. Larger houses, set on elevated terraces, were likely occupied by leaders, artisans, or families with specialized roles. Smaller dwellings clustered around them for common households and laborers. The arrangement of homes and public spaces speaks of both practical planning and symbolic order. Those who held social or ritual authority were physically elevated, visible from the plazas and terraces where communal activities occurred. Even in their placement, architecture communicated identity, hierarchy, and social cohesion. Trade and economic networks converged on San Lorenzo. The plateau's position between rivers and fertile floodplains allowed it to draw in agricultural surplus, craft products, and raw materials from surrounding villages. The elites likely coordinated distribution, while artisans worked in stone, clay, and shell. By concentrating labor, resources, and ritual activities, San Lorenzo became the focal point of early Olmec culture, a magnet for both economic and spiritual life. Surrounding villages participated, contributing surplus, goods, and manpower to maintain and embellish the central site. A calm discovery lies in the precision of Olmec planning. San Lorenzo was not a chaotic accumulation of structures, but a consciously organized environment. Plazas aligned with pathways and terraces, ceremonial spaces connected with residential zones, and drainage systems integrated seamlessly into the terrain. These choices reflect an understanding of both utility and symbolism, demonstrating a worldview in which human activity, ritual observance, and environmental care were interconnected. Life at San Lorenzo unfolded in gentle rhythms. Daily labor, tending terraces, crafting basalt sculptures, or maintaining canals, was balanced with ritual observance, social interaction, and the quiet routines of domestic life. Children played in the shade of terraces, women prepared food and wove textiles, men and skilled artisans carved stone, and elders guided ceremonial practices. These cycles created a sense of stability and belonging, a calm that contrasted with the monumental scale of the works surrounding them. Art and symbolism further reinforced identity. The Olmecs adorned ceremonial spaces with motifs of jaguars, serpents, and other hybrid creatures, imbuing the plaza with meaning that extended beyond the material. These images represented fertility, power, and the unseen forces believed to influence life and land. In the interaction of architecture, sculpture, and iconography, San Lorenzo became a living embodiment of Olmec beliefs, governance, and cultural vision, a place where society and spirituality were inseparable. Yet even as San Lorenzo rose, it remained in dialogue with the surrounding landscape. Rivers provided transport routes, fertile fields fed its population, and nearby villages contributed labor and resources. The city did not dominate the region by force, but by attraction. Its terraces, plazas, and monumental works drew people into participation, establishing patterns of political and spiritual centrality. In this way, San Lorenzo represents the earliest heart of a civilization, not through coercion, but through the deliberate cultivation of community, belief, and shared endeavor. The Olmecs of San Lorenzo achieved something remarkable. They reshaped the land, organized labor, developed complex social structures, and cultivated a distinct cultural identity, all without armies, formal states, or written law. Their capital was a place of vision, labor, and ritual, quietly establishing the rhythms that would define the Olmec world for centuries. Yet San Lorenzo's rise was only the first step. The region was beginning to weave itself into a network, connecting villages, ceremonial centers, and the broader Gulf Coast into the early fabric of Olmec civilization. How far did their influence travel in those early centuries? Even before the rise of San Lorenzo, the Olmecs were quietly weaving a web across Mesoamerica. Their influence was carried not by armies or conquest, but by the deliberate movement of materials, ideas, and artisans. Jade, a luminous green stone treasured for its rarity and spiritual significance, traveled hundreds of kilometers from the highlands of Guatemala into the Gulf Coast. Obsidian, sharp and dark as volcanic glass, arrived from distant Mexican highlands, valued for both toolmaking and ritual purposes. Basalt, quarried from the Tuxtla Mountains, was shaped into colossal heads, thrones, and ceremonial altars. And tropical cacao, already prized for its sweetness, made its way through rivers and overland paths into elite Olmec households. Each journey of these resources created connections between landscapes, peoples, and emerging cultural centers. These networks were far more than mere commerce. As goods moved along rivers, through forests, and across plains, so too did ideas and iconography. Carvers traveling with blocks of basalt shared techniques. Potters exchanged motifs that would appear in distant villages. Ritual specialists may have journeyed alongside merchants, transmitting beliefs about sacred animals, celestial cycles, and ceremonial practices. In this way, Olmec culture radiated beyond the heartland, touching communities that had never set foot on the elevated terraces of San Lorenzo or La Venta, yet now spoke a shared symbolic language. The logistics of trade were as carefully considered as the goods themselves. Canoes and rafts carried cargo along the winding rivers, while overland paths guided porters between valleys and lowlands. Communities along the way provided temporary shelter, sustenance, and local knowledge. Each exchange required trust, careful planning, and the ability to negotiate with neighbors who spoke different dialects or followed slightly different customs. The slow movement of trade, day by day, created social bonds and strengthened networks that were just as crucial to Olmec cohesion as ceremonial plazas or monumental sculpture. One calm discovery of this era is how trade reinforced hierarchy and specialization. Artisans who mastered carving jade or basalt were highly valued, as were those who understood the routes, weather patterns, and logistics of transporting delicate or massive materials. Leaders at San Lorenzo coordinated these efforts, ensuring that tribute, offerings, and crafted goods reached the right places at the right time. Through these practices, wealth, skill, and influence became tangible markers of social order, quietly reinforcing the emerging Olmec elite. Trade also allowed the Olmecs to access exotic and symbolic items that enhanced ritual life. Jade masks, miniature figurines, and ceremonial tools could be exchanged for everyday essentials. Yet they carried immense cultural significance. Each item functioned as a vessel of meaning, reinforcing shared cosmology and connecting communities separated by rivers, mountains, or forests. In this way, commerce became an instrument not just of wealth, but of identity and cultural diffusion. Beyond material goods, ideas traveled along these networks in subtler ways. Artistic styles, architectural concepts, and even early calendrical or ritual knowledge likely accompanied traders and artisans on their journeys. Communities far from the Olmec heartland began to adopt motifs such as jaguar imagery, cleft heads, and stylized human-animal hybrids. These symbols, once confined to the Gulf Coast, became threads linking distant peoples in a common cultural tapestry. Yet the networks were not rigid. They were dynamic, responsive to seasonal changes, political pressures, and the needs of individual communities. If a river swelled or a pass became impassable, alternative routes were sought. If a quarry temporarily ran dry, artisans would adapt materials. This flexibility allowed the Olmecs to maintain steady exchanges over decades, ensuring that their influence remained constant, even in a landscape of shifting rivers, dense forests, and rugged highlands. By connecting distant sources of raw materials, specialized artisans, and ceremonial centers, the Olmecs achieved something remarkable: the creation of a regional identity without coercion, a network sustained by mutual benefit, shared values, and the subtle prestige of rare materials. The movement of jade, obsidian, basalt, and cacao became a silent dialogue, linking villages, plazas, and sacred sites across hundreds of kilometers. And as these networks grew, so did the complexity of Olmec society. The circulation of goods, ideas, and rituals provided both material wealth and cultural cohesion, setting the stage for increasingly centralized political authority, more elaborate ceremonial centers, and the flourishing of art and religion that would define the Olmec civilization for centuries to come. What did it mean to rule in a world where the divine felt close? In the heart of the Olmec world, leadership was never merely a matter of physical strength or personal ambition. Authority was inseparable from the sacred, a delicate balance of political stewardship and spiritual responsibility. Early rulers were imagined as intermediaries between human communities and the unseen forces of nature, ancestors, and deities. Their power was reinforced not by coercion alone, but by the subtle, enduring weight of symbolism, ritual, and cosmic legitimacy. The Olmec rulers of San Lorenzo and later La Venta were adorned with regalia that conveyed this dual role. Jade ornaments, headdresses, and ceremonial clothing signaled both wealth and spiritual potency. Throne-like platforms elevated these leaders above the plazas, not as mere spectators, but as embodiments of order and mediation. In these elevated positions, rulers orchestrated ceremonies, directed labor, and guided agricultural cycles, aligning human activity with the rhythms of the cosmos. Their authority was as much a reflection of divine favor as it was of organizational skill. Artistic motifs further illustrate this sacred connection. The jaguar, a recurring symbol, embodies both ferocity and spiritual transformation. Many rulers are depicted in poses that suggest metamorphosis or communion with animal spirits, linking human governance to the mysteries of the natural and supernatural worlds. These images convey that leadership was a living dialogue with forces larger than the human community, forces that required careful interpretation and stewardship. In this sense, kingship was less about dominion and more about sustaining balance. Basalt thrones, altars, and sculpted reliefs reinforce the sacred authority of rulers. Each carefully carved object was both functional and symbolic. Thrones, often positioned in ceremonial plazas, provided a literal and figurative foundation for rulership. Jaguars, serpents, and transformation figures inscribed upon these platforms reminded observers of the intimate connection between political office and cosmic order. Through these symbols, the ruler's presence extended beyond the individual, anchoring society in a shared vision of legitimacy and purpose. One calm discovery of this period is the way governance intertwined with ritual scheduling. Leaders oversaw planting and harvest ceremonies, rain invocations, and offerings to ancestors. Their role was to ensure that human labor aligned with the natural and spiritual cycles that sustained life. By coordinating agricultural activity, ritual practice, and public labor, rulers maintained both the material and moral stability of their communities. Their authority, though hierarchical, was reinforced by visible, enduring contributions to communal welfare. Power was not exercised in isolation. Elite families, specialized artisans, and ritual specialists formed concentric circles around the ruler, each contributing to governance. Advisors interpreted omens, managed resources, or guided public ceremonies, while laborers and craftspeople transformed resources into monumental works of stone, ceramics, and jade. This collaborative hierarchy allowed rulers to focus on spiritual and strategic leadership, while networks of expertise ensured the smooth functioning of society. The construction of ceremonial platforms, terraces, and monumental heads reflects the practical application of authority. Mobilizing labor for these projects required subtle persuasion, ritual framing, and social consensus. By presenting these works as offerings to the divine and expressions of communal identity, rulers directed vast human effort in a way that reinforced hierarchy without coercion. The resulting structures were both functional and symbolic. They shaped the landscape physically while embedding social order within its very contours. Rulership also extended into everyday life. Leaders regulated resource distribution, organized irrigation, and managed trade flows, ensuring that the communities they guided remained resilient and interconnected. Authority was thus not abstract or ceremonial alone. It was deeply embedded in the rhythms of daily existence. From the orderly allocation of maize to the planning of communal labor, sacred leadership permeated both spiritual observance and practical management. Trade networks were further channels of political influence. Rulers coordinated the exchange of jade, basalt, and exotic goods, strengthening ties with distant communities and reinforcing their central role in society. By facilitating access to precious materials and rare commodities, leaders extended their presence beyond ceremonial plazas into the homes, workshops, and fields of the broader Olmec heartland. Through these subtle forms of power, authority became tangible in both material and symbolic terms. Another calm discovery lies in the embodiment of leadership through public display. The colossal heads, depicting serene yet commanding faces, projected authority across time and space. Even for those who never met a ruler in person, these images communicated stability, presence, and the enduring connection between human and divine. Each head functioned as a silent reminder of the cosmological order and the societal structures it underpinned. Through these interwoven threads, ritual, symbolism, labor organization, and economic oversight, the Olmec rulers established a model of governance that was both adaptive and enduring. Sacred leadership created a framework for social cohesion, ensuring that communities were aligned not just by necessity, but by shared belief in cosmic order. Hierarchy emerged naturally, flowing from visible demonstrations of competence, spiritual alignment, and the ability to coordinate collective effort. In this light, Olmec kingship is less about conquest or dominance than about careful stewardship of people, resources, and sacred forces. Authority was granted and maintained through competence, ritual observance, and symbolic presence. By blending the political and the divine, these early leaders created a system that guided society gently, yet firmly, toward stability and cohesion. From these rulers flowed a structured society. Labor, ritual, trade, and art were all interlinked, forming the engine that powered Olmec civilization. In this balance of authority and sacred responsibility, the foundations of governance and social hierarchy were laid. A rhythm of leadership that would guide the Olmecs for generations, shaping their communities and the cultural legacy they left for the Americas. Who shaped the stone, carved the jade, and tended the fields? In the quiet rhythms of Olmec life, monumental centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta did not arise from the ambitions of rulers alone. They were the result of countless hours of labor, the delicate hands of artisans, and the steady work of skilled specialists. Stoneworkers hewed basalt into colossal heads and thrones, balancing weight, precision, and vision. Jade carvers transformed dense, green stones into masks, ornaments, and ritual implements, their tools etching surfaces with patience and care. Rubber makers, the first in the Americas to process latex, crafted materials for balls used in ceremonial games. Potters shaped clay into vessels, figurines, and ritual objects, contributing both practical tools and symbols of cultural identity. These artisans were supported by systems of organization that allowed their work to flourish. Labor was coordinated with ceremonial calendars, agricultural cycles, and construction schedules. Families often specialized in certain crafts across generations, passing techniques and knowledge like whispered secrets. Apprentices observed elders shaping stone or pressing clay, gradually absorbing both skill and the spiritual significance embedded in each creation. In this way, technical mastery became inseparable from cultural continuity. The scale of Olmec construction required careful planning and collaboration. Teams of workers moved massive basalt blocks from quarries, sometimes kilometers away, along rivers or specially prepared paths. Logs, ropes, and rafts became tools for transport. Coordinated effort transformed raw material into monumental art. While colossal heads symbolized rulers, each one also represents the patience, ingenuity, and collective effort of the people who shaped it. These monuments were not created in solitude. They were the product of communal expertise. Daily life for artisans combined labor with ritual and reflection. Stoneworkers paused to observe the grain of basalt, considering how natural features might inform shape and design. Jade carvers felt the texture of dense minerals, planning cuts that would reveal eyes, faces, or symbolic motifs. Potters prepared clay, tested firing conditions, and experimented with pigment and design. Each task demanded attention, discipline, and a quiet dialogue with both material and meaning. Work was a meditative act, producing objects of beauty, utility, and sacred resonance. Specialists extended beyond the creation of monuments and crafts. Farmers, field hands, and fishers ensured food security for laborers and elites alike. Engineers maintained terraces, drainage systems, and canals, ensuring that water and soil remained productive. Ritual specialists performed ceremonies to bless crops, mark seasonal transitions, and honor ancestors. Each contribution, whether visible or subtle, strengthened the functioning of Olmec society. The civilization's enduring achievements depended on these interdependent networks of skill, knowledge, and effort. Trade also relied on specialists. Merchants coordinated the movement of jade, obsidian, basalt, and other precious resources. Scribes and record-keepers documented transactions, debts, and ceremonial offerings. Their meticulous records ensured continuity across generations, allowing Olmec leaders to plan construction, organize labor, and maintain social cohesion. In this sense, skilled work was both material and administrative, sustaining not only art and architecture but also governance. One calm discovery of this era is the integration of craft with cultural symbolism. Each object, each structure, carried meaning beyond its practical purpose. Colossal heads were simultaneously portraits, symbols of authority, and markers of collective achievement. Jade figurines served ritual functions, connected communities across distance, and embodied ideals of transformation, fertility, and power. In shaping material culture, artisans were also shaping the social and spiritual life of the Olmec world. Work was not uniform. It reflected status, expertise, and specialization. Some laborers focused on heavy construction, others on delicate carving, others on domestic or agricultural support. Coordination required subtle leadership and planning, often guided by ritual calendars or overseen by elites. Yet, despite differences in task and prestige, every effort contributed to the civilization's coherence. Monumental centers, thriving plazas, and complex ritual landscapes emerged from the combined energy of many hands and minds, each attuned to its place in a larger pattern. Life within this network of labor had a rhythm both communal and personal. Field hands greeted the dawn with quiet diligence. Artisans worked at the bench or quarry as the sun moved overhead, and families maintained homes, gardens, and workshops in careful balance. Celebrations punctuated labor, offerings at shrines, feasts to honor the completion of a monument, and seasonal rituals that bound the community together. Through these practices, work became an expression of shared purpose, a tangible link between effort, culture, and spirituality. In observing these skilled specialists, we see the Olmecs' understanding of human potential and collaboration. They recognized that monumental achievements required more than individual vision. They required networks of knowledge, careful planning, and patient execution. Authority, artistry, and sustenance were intertwined in daily life, forming the engine that powered society. Each artisan, laborer, and specialist was a living thread in the tapestry of Olmec civilization. Yet society was supported not only by specialists, but by the many. Farmers, families, and communities beyond the monumental centers provided the essential foundation, food, resources, and labor, that allowed the Olmecs to thrive. Their quiet, steady contributions ensured that monuments were built, rituals performed, and culture preserved. It was this broad base of human effort that transformed individual skill into enduring civilization. What was a gentle day like for an Olmec farmer or fisher? Long before the colossal heads and monumental plazas dominated the imagination, Life in the Olmec heartland unfolded in quiet, enduring rhythms. Families rose with the sun, stepping onto fertile floodplains where rivers deposited rich soil, perfect for maize, beans, and squash. Children ran along muddy paths between thatched houses, while adults tended gardens and small plots, carefully observing the cycles of rain, sun, and soil. Farming was both practical and meditative, a daily dialogue with the land, guided by observation, experience, and subtle ritual. Fishing, another cornerstone of subsistence, followed the gentle pulse of rivers and streams. Nets and woven traps were set with care, early in the morning when the waters were calm. Families worked together, pulling fish and shellfish from the shallows, sharing the catch with neighbors and kin. Each day required attention, patience, and a quiet understanding of the environment. How tides shifted, where fish congregated, and when seasonal changes affected abundance. In these small acts, humans harmonized with the rhythms of the natural world. Food preparation, while mundane by later standards, was imbued with a sense of order and care. Maize kernels were nixtamalized, ground into flour, and shaped into tortillas. Squash and beans were roasted or boiled over gentle fires. Families gathered to share meals, their conversations quietly reinforcing social bonds, transmitting knowledge, and passing down oral traditions. Through these simple acts, the Olmecs nurtured both body and community, embedding stability and continuity into daily life. Villages were centers not only of production but also of interaction and learning. Children observed elders crafting tools, pottery, or textiles. Skills were passed down slowly, through observation, repetition, and gentle correction. Storytelling punctuated the workday, sharing lessons, myths, and history. These narratives connected each generation to the landscape, the ancestors, and the emerging sense of Olmec identity. Life was both practical and symbolic, every gesture anchored in survival and meaning. Seasonal rhythms structured the flow of the year. Planting, tending, and harvest dictated the tempo of labor, while rains, floods, and river migrations influenced fishing and hunting cycles. Ceremonial events, tied to agricultural milestones, punctuated daily toil, providing moments of reflection, gratitude, and communal cohesion. In this way, Olmec villagers experienced time not as abstract, but as a series of interconnected cycles, each movement and decision part of a larger, harmonious pattern. Community rituals were woven into the fabric of daily life. Offerings of food, small figurines, or decorated stones were placed at household shrines. Families performed quiet ceremonies to ensure good harvests, health, and protection. These acts reinforced connections between humans, land, and the unseen forces that shaped their world. Even the simplest gestures, a seed planted, a net set, a fire lit, carried an awareness of this broader spiritual context. Agriculture and subsistence work supported more than just survival. Surpluses enabled some families to specialize in crafts, construction, or trade, which in turn fed the growth of ceremonial centers and political organization. The careful management of resources allowed the Olmecs to maintain social stability, cultivate monumental projects, and expand their influence beyond the village. Daily labor, modest as it seemed, became the engine that sustained civilization. Another calm discovery lies in the rhythms of collaboration. Tasks were often shared among neighbors and kin. Fields were worked together, harvests distributed, and communal spaces maintained. Through cooperation, individuals experienced not only productivity but also social reinforcement, trust, and interdependence. In a landscape of rivers, forests, and floodplains, such networks were essential, quietly shaping both social and spiritual cohesion. Leisure, reflection, and play were integral to daily life. Children played with simple toys, adults engaged in storytelling, and neighbors exchanged news and counsel. These quiet moments allowed for human connection, creativity, and learning. Even in the midst of labor, Olmec communities cultivated spaces for joy, contemplation, and continuity. Work and rest existed in balance, forming a gentle rhythm that sustained both people and culture. Through observation of villagers, farmers, and fishers, we see how ordinary life was deeply intertwined with broader societal structures. The efforts of families in fields, rivers, and workshops provided the material foundation for monumental centers, political organization, and spiritual observance. In tending the land, sharing food, and participating in rituals, everyday Olmecs sustained the heartbeat of their civilization. And beneath these rhythms, a spiritual world was ever present. Every seed, fish, and harvest was linked to cycles of blessing, offering, and ancestral memory. Daily life and sacred observance were inseparable, shaping both the material and intangible patterns that would define Olmec society for centuries to come. Why does the jaguar appear everywhere in their world? In the lush lowlands of the Olmec heartland, the world was alive with unseen forces. Rivers murmured with spirits, forests sheltered powerful beings, and the soil itself seemed to hold memory. To navigate this vibrant, sometimes unpredictable world, the Olmecs conceived a pantheon of deities and sacred symbols, figures that guided their understanding of life, death, fertility, and cosmic order. Chief among these were the rain god, the maize god, and the enigmatic wer-jaguar, each reflecting the delicate balance between the tangible and the spiritual. The rain god embodied the life-giving waters that flowed through rivers and nourished the fertile floodplains. Sculptures and figurines suggest a being both potent and nurturing, capable of blessing the land with abundance or reminding humans of their dependency through storms and floods. Rain was not merely weather. It was a sacred force, intimately tied to survival, agriculture, and ritual practice. Ceremonies invoked this deity, often incorporating offerings, chants, and symbolic imagery that harmonized human activity with natural cycles. Equally central was the maize god, representing sustenance, growth, and the continuity of life. Maize, the cornerstone of Olmec agriculture, was more than food. It was a symbol of existence itself. Ritual depictions of the maize god often feature elongated faces or plant-like features, blending human and botanical forms. Through these images, the Olmecs expressed the inseparability of humans and the crops that sustained them, acknowledging the cycles of germination, harvest, and renewal. Seasonal ceremonies celebrated the maize god, marking planting, tending, and harvest with reverence and rhythm. Perhaps the most striking figure in Olmec symbolism is the wer-jaguar, a hybrid being combining human and jaguar features. This creature appears in sculpture, pottery, and small figurines, often with cleft heads, downturned mouths, and expressive eyes. The wer-jaguar embodies transformation, power, and the liminal space between worlds, the human and the animal, the mortal and the divine. Its recurring presence in Olmec art suggests an enduring preoccupation with thresholds, moments where humans intersect with forces beyond ordinary understanding. The jaguar, fierce yet graceful, symbolized strength, fertility, and spiritual potency, weaving through ritual, governance, and daily life. Olmec cosmology emphasized duality. Sky and earth, water and land, life and death. These opposites were not opposed but complementary. Many symbols reflect this balance, with serpents, jaguars, and anthropomorphic figures illustrating cycles of creation, destruction, and regeneration. Ceremonial spaces often incorporated this worldview. Plazas aligned with celestial events, altars marking cardinal directions, and carvings representing both terrestrial and celestial beings. Through such careful integration, architecture, art, and ritual reflected a coherent vision of the cosmos, guiding communities in both action and contemplation. Objects themselves carried spiritual resonance. Jade figurines, basalt masks, and ritual stones were not merely aesthetic. They functioned as conduits for divine presence. Small carvings could be held, transported, or offered, connecting everyday humans with the forces shaping their environment. Each object was a dialogue between material and meaning, a quiet reminder that the sacred was woven into all aspects of Olmec life. One calm discovery is how deeply interconnected these symbols were with human experience. The jaguar prowled in the forests humans relied upon for food and materials. Rain dictated the success of crops, and maize formed the staple of daily sustenance. By personifying these forces, the Olmecs gave order and narrative to their world. Rituals, myths, and art became ways of understanding uncertainty and cultivating harmony with the environment. Ceremonial practices extended from the household to the monumental centers. Small offerings were placed at shrines, while large-scale rituals unfolded on plazas, terraces, and platforms. These gatherings reinforced social cohesion, structured labor, and reaffirmed hierarchy, all under the attentive gaze of divine symbols. The gods were never distant abstractions. They were present in water, soil, crops, and the daily gestures of life, guiding both the ordinary and the extraordinary. Art and architecture worked together to convey cosmological ideas. Relief carvings depicted transformation scenes, jaguar motifs adorned altars, and plazas were arranged to echo natural or celestial patterns. Through these designs, the Olmecs created a visual and spatial vocabulary for understanding the sacred. Communities navigated their lives in dialogue with these symbols, allowing spiritual awareness to shape work, ceremony, and governance alike. Even in quieter moments, planting seeds, drawing water, or resting beneath trees, the presence of deities was felt. Ritual observances were gentle, rhythmic, and integrated into the flow of life, rather than imposed through ceremony alone. In this way, religion was a living landscape, as natural and pervasive as rivers or forests, shaping thought, behavior, and collective identity with subtlety and care. These beings shaped rituals both humble and grand. From offerings of maize at household shrines to orchestrated ceremonies in ceremonial plazas, Olmec gods and symbols guided the moral, agricultural, and social life of communities. They provided a framework for understanding existence, mediating human action, and connecting the ordinary with the extraordinary. Through their reverent attention to the sacred, the Olmecs wove a cosmology that anchored society, nurtured culture, and ensured that both people and place remained intertwined in a quietly enduring world. What did it mean to cross the boundary between worlds? In the Olmec heartland, ritual was not merely ceremony. It was a journey into realms both visible and unseen. Shamans, priests, and ritual specialists guided communities through these delicate crossings, moving between the human and spiritual worlds. These figures embodied transformation, sometimes literally depicted in art as human-animal hybrids, sometimes enacted through trance, dance, or ritualized performance. Their presence provided a link between daily life, the natural environment, and the sacred forces that shaped the Olmec cosmos. Transformation was the central concept. Figurines, carvings, and reliefs depict humans assuming jaguar traits, sharp claws, elongated faces, and feline eyes. These images were not fanciful decoration. They represented spiritual states, liminal moments in which mortals engaged with divine or animal powers. In rituals, shamans might enter altered states through fasting, rhythmic movement, or ingestion of hallucinogenic substances, experiencing visions that connected them to the cycles of fertility, rain, and cosmic order. Such journeys were both personal and communal, reinforcing social bonds and guiding collective decision-making. Bloodletting, another profound practice, offered a quiet but potent means of communication with the divine. Leaders and ritual specialists might draw small amounts of blood, believing that the offering nourished deities or ancestors and maintained balance in the world. These acts were deliberate and measured, performed with care and reverence, reflecting an understanding of sacrifice as both symbolic and transformative. They reinforced the sacred authority of rulers while connecting ordinary people to the rhythms of cosmic reciprocity. Ceremonial objects amplified the potency of rituals. Jade figurines, basalt altars, and obsidian blades served as conduits for spiritual energy, linking the material and immaterial realms. In some cases, crafted items depicted hybrid forms or abstract patterns, guiding participants in meditation, visualization, and ritual enactment. Each object was a focal point for attention, a bridge between the tangible work of human hands and the intangible currents of the sacred world. Shamans also interpreted natural signs, storms, river flows, eclipses, and animal behavior, as messages from deities. By observing these patterns, they advised rulers and communities, aligning agricultural and social decisions with perceived cosmic rhythms. Their insight ensured that human activity remained synchronized with the natural and spiritual worlds, fostering harmony in both material and cultural landscapes. Through this careful guidance, Olmec communities navigated uncertainty with reflection, patience, and trust in ancestral wisdom. One calm discovery of this period is the way transformation permeated everyday life. Not all ritual was grand or ceremonial. Small gestures, touching sacred stones, placing offerings at household shrines, or mimicking animal movements during dance, embedded spiritual awareness into daily routines. These practices reinforced the idea that humans were part of a larger network of forces, and that life itself could be a site of sacred encounter. Artistic expression reflected and guided these beliefs. Relief carvings on altars and ceremonial platforms often depict dynamic scenes of metamorphosis. Humans becoming jaguars, serpents intertwining with figures, and symbolic gestures bridging life and death. These images functioned as both teaching tools and focal points for meditation, reminding observers of the subtle and pervasive nature of transformation. Through imagery, the Olmecs cultivated a worldview in which spiritual insight was inseparable from the material and social world. Communal participation was essential. Villagers, artisans, and leaders all contributed to the enactment of rituals, whether through crafting sacred items, preparing ceremonial spaces, or observing proper etiquette. Even those not directly entering trance states participated by maintaining the rhythm, supporting ritual specialists, or attending public ceremonies. The resulting experience was holistic, embedding spiritual awareness into the fabric of society. Rituals also influenced spatial organization. Ceremonial plazas, mounds, and platforms were designed to facilitate observation, participation, and the movement of participants. Alignments with rivers, cardinal directions, or celestial events reflected the integration of sacred practice into the physical landscape. Architecture became a silent partner in ritual, guiding movement, framing spectacle, and reflecting cosmological principles in stone and earth. Through these practices, the Olmecs developed a sophisticated understanding of liminality. Crossing boundaries between human and animal, mortal and divine, life and death, was not feared but carefully navigated. Rituals provided structure, guidance, and meaning, allowing communities to engage with the profound forces that shaped existence. By honoring these transitions, the Olmecs maintained balance, fostered social cohesion, and sustained cultural continuity. Their beliefs shaped their cities as well. Ceremonial platforms, plazas, and monumental sculptures were physical expressions of spiritual principles. The organization of space, the placement of sculptures, and the choreography of public rituals reflected the pervasive influence of transformation and sacred guidance. In this way, cosmology was not abstract. It was embedded in both daily life and the enduring structures that continue to testify to the Olmecs' profound engagement with the unseen world. How did hills and rivers become places of power? In the Olmec world, the landscape itself was alive with meaning. Rivers, hills, springs, and caves were not mere backdrops for human activity. They were portals to the divine, spaces where the veil between the mundane and the sacred felt thin. Travelers along winding rivers might pause to regard a spring bubbling with life, sensing it as a place of renewal or communication with ancestors. Jagged hills rising from lowlands became markers of potency, natural pyramids shaping the rhythm of the surrounding terrain. Caves, often hidden and echoing, were particularly significant. Entering a cave was considered a journey into the underworld, a passage through which shamans and ritual participants could access spiritual insight. Water dripping from stalactites, the hush of darkness, and the narrow passageways created an intimate, contemplative environment. Offerings found in Olmec caves, figurines, shells, and jade beads, attest to centuries of human reverence, suggesting a deep understanding of place as inherently sacred. Springs and river bends provided life-sustaining water, but also a canvas for imagination and ritual. Seasonal flooding, with its fertility and potential threat, was interpreted as a dialogue with divine forces. The flowing waters were both literal sustenance and metaphorical symbol, a bridge between realms, a reminder of dependency, and a source of inspiration for ceremony. Villagers, artisans, and rulers alike recognized that attending to these sacred points nurtured both crops and spiritual well-being. Mountains and hills held similar importance. Rising above the floodplains, they offered perspective, literal and symbolic, on human endeavor. From their slopes, observers could witness the breadth of villages, rivers, and ceremonial centers, reflecting the integration of natural and constructed spaces. These elevated landscapes became focal points for ritual, observation, and reflection, places where communities gathered to honor ancestors, deities, and the cycles of life. The Olmecs also associated specific geographic features with mythic stories. Rivers might trace routes of ancestral journeys, caves serve as wombs of creation, and hills mark sacred thresholds. By embedding narratives into the natural environment, the Olmecs wove memory, belief, and geography into a cohesive spiritual landscape. Each location was both practical and symbolic, a living archive of myth and devotion. One calm discovery of this era is the gentle integration of daily life with sacred geography. Farmers planted crops with awareness of nearby springs, children played along riverbanks imbued with ritual significance, and artisans drew inspiration from caves or hills while carving objects or designing monuments. The physical world became a constant companion in spiritual reflection, a framework that guided both action and imagination. Rivers, in particular, served multiple layers of purpose. They were trade routes, sources of food, and ceremonial markers. Canoes glided silently along their surfaces, carrying offerings or travelers, connecting settlements while reinforcing the sanctity of water. Rituals along riverbanks aligned human activity with natural flows, reminding communities of their place in the broader patterns of life. Water, in all its forms, was a constant teacher, sustainer, and symbol. Sacred landscapes were further reflected in the placement of monumental centers. Sites like San Lorenzo and La Venta were carefully positioned in relation to rivers, hills, and floodplains. Temples and plazas harmonized with natural contours, creating a dialogue between construction and terrain. In this way, the Olmecs orchestrated a spatial symphony in which human architecture complemented the spiritual significance of the environment, blending artistry, religion, and practicality. Caves and springs also served as repositories for offerings and symbolic acts. Small figurines, shells, and carved stones were placed deliberately, often in quiet alcoves or flowing waters. These acts were intimate, reflective, and sustained over generations. They demonstrate a sustained attention to place, an understanding that human presence could honor and sustain the sacred essence of the environment. Here, the boundary between people and landscape became permeable, with ritual action enhancing both human and cosmic order. The broader lesson of Olmec sacred landscapes is the harmony between human life and natural forces. By recognizing hills, rivers, springs, and caves as inherently powerful, the Olmecs cultivated a worldview in which humans were participants rather than masters. Their settlements, rituals, and art were informed by these spaces, reflecting an enduring respect for the natural world and its spiritual resonance. Even mundane actions, planting, walking, building, were informed by awareness of sacred geography, creating a life attuned to the rhythms of earth, water, and sky. And nowhere is this spiritual vision clearer than in their art. Through monumental heads, figurines, and carvings, Olmec creators captured the essence of gods, animals, and mythic forces. Every object, like the landscape itself, became a window into the sacred, connecting the observer with the rivers, hills, and caves that structured both daily life and cosmological understanding. In this quiet interplay of nature, ritual, and material culture. The Olmecs expressed a vision of the world that was both grounded and transcendent, inviting reflection, reverence, and enduring wonder. Whose faces watch us across time? In the lush lowlands of Veracruz and Tabasco, immense basalt heads rise from the earth, their calm, watchful expressions linking the present to a world long past. The Olmec colossal heads, some reaching over 3 meters in height and weighing several tons, are perhaps the most enduring symbols of their civilization. Yet they were never mere decoration. Each head embodies leadership, memory, and the careful choreography of human effort, reflecting a society capable of monumental vision without violence or haste. Carving these heads required extraordinary skill. Artisans selected basalt from quarries in the Tuxtla Mountains, noting natural cracks, density, and color. Using stone tools, they chipped, ground, and polished the surfaces with meticulous attention to detail. The process could take years for a single head, demanding patience and deep understanding of material properties. Every facial feature, helmet, and contour was intentional, blending realistic portraiture with symbolic significance. Through these carvings, the Olmecs expressed both authority and collective memory. Transporting the heads was an equally monumental task. Teams of workers moved them across rivers and floodplains, employing rafts, sledges, and coordinated human effort. The journey itself was likely ritualized, a procession of labor that honored both the subject of the carving and the forces guiding the endeavor. Each relocation reinforced social cohesion, demonstrating what could be achieved when skill, patience, and collaboration aligned. In this way, movement became part of meaning, the journey as significant as the destination. The faces themselves are remarkable in their individuality. Helmets or headgear suggest status, protection, or ceremonial significance. Eyes and mouths convey calm authority, introspection, or quiet strength. Each head is simultaneously personal and symbolic, representing rulers who shaped communities while embodying ideals of leadership. They remind observers that governance was not abstract. It was lived, negotiated, and memorialized in stone. One calm discovery is how these heads connect communities across space. Their locations were deliberate, marking plazas, ceremonial centers, or axes of movement. Travelers, villagers, and pilgrims would have encountered them as both physical and spiritual markers, guiding action and reflection. They were focal points of memory, linking human ambition with ritual, natural landscape, and the enduring presence of leadership. Carving, moving, and erecting colossal heads also fostered innovation and experimentation. Techniques in quarrying, transport, and sculpting were honed over generations, creating cumulative knowledge that would influence later Olmec projects. These monuments were living laboratories, where creativity, labor, and communal effort coalesced. They transformed raw stone into cultural memory, teaching future generations the possibilities of patience, vision, and coordinated action. Beyond their physicality, the heads carry symbolic weight. They memorialize rulers, capture ideals of power, and mediate between ordinary life and ceremonial space. Through them, the Olmecs engaged with mortality, memory, and identity. Each massive form served as a quiet reminder that human endeavor, when guided by intention and skill, could endure for millennia, connecting hands and hearts across centuries. Daily life and monumental art intertwined. Laborers, artisans, and ritual specialists participated in both the creation and the veneration of these works. The process required technical skill, social coordination, and spiritual awareness. In crafting these heads, communities reflected on leadership, collective memory, and the human place within natural and sacred landscapes. Each chisel mark, each transported stone, was an expression of care, attention, and cultural continuity. In quiet moments, the colossal heads invite reflection. Their calm gaze, balanced proportions, and serene authority encourage viewers to consider not only the individuals they portray, but the society that created them. They embody patience, foresight, and reverence for the interplay of human skill and natural material. They are a bridge from past to present, reminding us that even in a world without written histories, memory can be carved, transported, and honored in stone. But stone was only one canvas. The Olmecs also expressed creativity and spiritual insight in jade, ceramics, rubber, and other materials, weaving a broader tapestry of art, ritual, and monumentality. In this quiet interplay of form, medium, and meaning, we begin to glimpse the full scope of Olmec aesthetic vision, a civilization attentive to both material mastery and the subtleties of symbolic resonance. Why did green hold such deep meaning? Among the dense forests and winding rivers of the Olmec heartland, a small, vibrant mineral carried extraordinary significance. Jade, with its deep green glow and remarkable durability, became both a material and a symbol, representing life, fertility, authority, and connection to the sacred. Its rarity and beauty meant that objects carved from jade were precious, often reserved for elite individuals, ritual use, or burial offerings. To hold jade was to touch a piece of the divine, a tangible link between human and cosmic realms. The Olmecs sourced jade from distant regions, often traveling hundreds of kilometers from the Motagua River Valley in Guatemala. This long journey underscores both the value placed on the stone and the extensive networks that connected communities across Mesoamerica. Jade's transport required careful planning, negotiation, and cooperation, making each piece an artifact not only of artistry but of human endeavor and social coordination. Carving jade was an exacting process. Artisans used abrasives, grinding stones, and cord to shape and polish the stone, transforming raw chunks into figurines, beads, or small ceremonial objects. This work demanded patience, dexterity, and intimate knowledge of the mineral's properties. Unlike softer materials, jade resisted impulsive shaping. Every curve, line, and incision was deliberate. The act of creation itself became a form of meditation, reflecting the care, attention, and spiritual awareness of the craftsman. Symbolism was woven into every piece. Small figurines might depict infants, jaguars, or hybrid creatures, echoing themes found in Olmec cosmology. Jade objects were often placed in burials, suggesting beliefs about life, death, and continuity. A jade pendant resting on a child's chest or a carved figure accompanying an elite ruler was more than ornamentation. It was a spiritual companion, a marker of status, and a medium for conveying cultural narratives across time. Through these objects, the living maintained contact with ancestors, deities, and community memory. One calm discovery is the way jade objects mediated human relationships. They were exchanged as gifts, offered in rituals, and incorporated into trade, reinforcing bonds, obligations, and social cohesion. Jade's durability ensured that these gestures could endure across generations, preserving both material beauty and the subtle networks of trust and reciprocity that shaped Olmec society. In this way, the stone itself became a silent witness to human connection. Beyond funerary and ceremonial contexts, jade inspired reflection and aesthetic appreciation. The Olmecs recognized the interplay of color, translucence, and form, crafting pieces that harmonized with natural light, tactile sensation, and symbolic meaning. Holding a jade figurine, one could sense its weight, smoothness, and the skill of its creator. A meditation on the interface of nature, human hands, and imagination. The stone bridged material and spiritual realms, linking daily life to eternal principles. Jade also carried metaphors for growth and vitality. Its green hue evoked maize, vegetation, and renewal, reinforcing themes of fertility central to Olmec religion. By embedding these associations into ritual and art, the Olmecs cultivated a holistic worldview in which objects were more than objects. They were carriers of meaning, conduits of power, and anchors for reflection. Ritualized handling of jade was deliberate and careful. Objects were often polished before ceremonies, worn during processions, or placed in shrines with reverence. Such gestures emphasized the living quality of the stone. It was not passive but imbued with agency, capable of influencing human perception and spiritual awareness. In this calm engagement with material, the Olmecs practiced patience, mindfulness, and reverence. Trade and connectivity magnified jade's significance. Moving from quarry to workshop to settlement, each piece carried stories, human effort, and social memory. A single object could link distant regions, transmit symbolic vocabulary, and reinforce cultural continuity. Jade's journey mirrored that of ideas, rituals, and authority. Slowly, deliberately, and with profound impact on human imagination and society. And from jade to basalt, their artistic world expanded. The monumental heads, altars, and other stoneworks complemented the subtle elegance of jade, together forming a material and symbolic universe. In this interplay of hard stone and precious mineral, the Olmecs articulated both the grandeur of leadership and the intimacy of ritual, capturing a civilization attentive to beauty, meaning, and continuity across time. What stories hide in each carved line? Beyond the colossal heads and precious jade, the Olmecs shaped a world rich with altars, thrones, stelae, masks, figurines, and polished mirrors, artifacts that bridged ritual, authority, and daily life. Each piece, whether monumental or portable, was carefully conceived, carrying subtle messages about leadership, cosmology, and human experience. Together, these works created a material language that informed how communities understood themselves and their world. Altars and thrones occupied central positions in ceremonial plazas. These stone platforms, often carved from basalt, were not merely functional. They were imbued with symbolic authority. Reliefs etched into their surfaces depict rulers, deities, and transformation motifs, inviting observers to witness divine interaction and human leadership intertwined. Thrones, in particular, signified status and sacred responsibility, reflecting the intimate connection between governance and ritual life. Sitting upon one was both an act of power and a gesture of cosmic alignment. Stelae, upright carved stones, recorded moments of memory, myth, and political significance. Though the Olmecs left no fully deciphered writing system, these objects communicate through imagery, posture, and iconography. Figures in motion, jaguar motifs, and abstract designs reveal beliefs, ceremonies, and social hierarchy. Each line and contour was deliberate, a quiet story preserved in stone for future generations to interpret, inviting reflection rather than demanding spectacle. Masks and figurines brought sacred imagery into homes and smaller ceremonial spaces. Crafted from jade, clay, or stone, these objects depicted humans, deities, or hybrid forms, providing a tangible connection to ritual worlds. In domestic settings, masks might accompany offerings or meditative practices. Figurines could serve as guides during personal reflection or markers of lineage and memory. Through intimate interaction with these objects, Olmecs integrated the sacred into daily life, ensuring that ritual awareness extended beyond monumental plazas. Polished mirrors and other reflective surfaces added another dimension. These objects invited contemplation, self-recognition, and spiritual engagement. Holding or observing a mirror was a subtle ritual, a quiet means of connecting the mortal self with divine or transformative forces. Such artifacts demonstrate the Olmecs' attention to perception, reflection, and the intimate ways humans might encounter sacred principles through crafted objects. One calm discovery in studying these works is how portable and monumental art interacted. A child playing near a small figurine or a priest observing a grand altar shared a continuum of symbolic experience. Art was not confined to elite spaces. It mediated everyday life, connecting the ordinary with the extraordinary. Each creation, whether held in hand or standing tall in a plaza, was a participant in a broader dialogue of meaning, memory, and social cohesion. The act of creation itself was contemplative. Carving, polishing, and painting required patience, care, and subtle skill. Each line, curve, or polish reflected thoughtfulness, attention to material, and awareness of audience. Through their work, artisans engaged in a dialogue with both the physical medium and the cultural imagination, shaping objects that could endure both time and memory. Art also reflected transformation, a recurring theme in Olmec cosmology. Many thrones, altars, and figurines depict hybrid beings, liminal moments, or ritualized gestures. These images reinforce the ideas explored in Chapter 4, life as a continuous negotiation between human, animal, and divine realms. By integrating such motifs into everyday objects and monumental structures alike, the Olmecs cultivated a pervasive awareness of liminality, transition, and balance. Communities gathered around these creations. Ceremonial performances unfolded on plazas with altars at the center. Portable figurines were handled during offerings. Masks adorned participants in ritual dances. Art mediated social life, guiding participation, reinforcing hierarchy, and maintaining continuity with ancestral knowledge. Its presence was both functional and reflective, shaping perception while embodying cultural memory. These creations stood at the heart of their cities. From the polished sheen of a jade figurine to the imposing presence of a basalt altar, Olmec art integrated authority, spirituality, and communal life. Each object, whether monumental or intimate, invited observation, reflection, and reverence. Through these quiet gestures, the Olmecs built a civilization attentive to meaning, memory, and the enduring dialogue between human skill and the sacred world. How did a plateau become the cradle of civilization? Rising above the braided rivers and fertile floodplains of Veracruz, San Lorenzo emerged as the first great Olmec center, a place where landscape, labor, and imagination converged to shape early civilization. Built atop a man-made plateau, the site reflects both practical planning and symbolic intent. The Olmecs reshaped the terrain, leveling earth, creating terraces, and integrating drainage systems that responded to seasonal flooding. This careful attention to environment demonstrates an early understanding of engineering, sustainability, and harmony with natural forces. Walking through San Lorenzo in the mind's eye, one encounters plazas lined with monumental sculptures, terraces that organize daily and ceremonial movement, and the first colossal heads carved from basalt. These heads, each with its unique expression, marked the presence of rulers and anchored civic identity. Basalt altars and thrones, carved with jaguar and transformation motifs, reinforced spiritual authority while providing gathering spaces for ritual activity. In this serene landscape, governance, religion, and communal life flowed together seamlessly. San Lorenzo also reveals the rhythms of daily life and social organization. Residential compounds, artisan workshops, and storage pits demonstrate careful attention to human needs, labor distribution, and craft specialization. Potters, jade carvers, and stoneworkers labored alongside farmers and fishermen, forming a complex, interdependent society. Here, monumental ambition and humble craft coexisted, creating a living network that connected rulers, ritual specialists, and villagers in a shared vision of order and meaning. Trade and connectivity further amplified San Lorenzo's importance. Obsidian, jade, and basalt traveled from distant regions, while cacao, shells, and other tropical goods flowed in and out of the center. These exchanges spread Olmec cultural influence far beyond the plateau, linking San Lorenzo to a wider world of ideas, resources, and spiritual practice. Through commerce, art, and ritual, the city became both a physical and symbolic hub of innovation. Yet, even the most enduring centers face change. Around 900 BCE, San Lorenzo experienced gradual decline, possibly due to environmental shifts, river course changes, or social transformations. Monuments were toppled or abandoned, and elite activity shifted elsewhere. Despite this, the city's legacy persisted. Techniques, iconography, and ceremonial models developed at San Lorenzo informed subsequent Olmec centers, ensuring continuity of cultural and spiritual traditions. A calm discovery emerges in reflecting on San Lorenzo. Its significance lies not only in monumental achievement, but in the subtle orchestration of space, labor, and belief. The city demonstrates that early civilization was as much about attentive stewardship of landscape and community as it was about power or spectacle. Each plaza, terrace, and sculpture reveals a civilization learning to integrate the practical, spiritual, and aesthetic dimensions of life. The plateau itself, transformed by human hands yet shaped by nature, exemplifies this interplay. Elevated spaces offered safety, oversight, and perspective, while riverine surroundings provided sustenance and connectivity. In harmonizing architecture, natural terrain, and ritual, the Olmecs created a center that was simultaneously functional, symbolic, and enduring, a microcosm of their evolving worldview. In the quiet spaces between monuments, one can imagine daily life unfolding. Artisans polishing jade, children playing near storage pits, elders observing ritual sequences, and leaders presiding over ceremonies. These moments, woven together across the plateau, form a tapestry of human endeavor, reflection, and memory that endures through the surviving structures. San Lorenzo was not a static display, but a living, breathing city attuned to both earthly and spiritual rhythms. From here, new centers rose. As San Lorenzo's influence waned, the Olmec heartland shifted attention to emerging cities such as La Venta and Tres. These sites would inherit techniques, symbols, and social structures established on the plateau, expanding upon them and creating a landscape of interconnected monumental centers. The story of San Lorenzo is thus both a beginning and a foundation, a testament to the Olmec's capacity for innovation, reverence for place, and enduring vision of communal life. What rituals once filled its sacred pyramid? On the humid plains of Tabasco, La Venta rose like a spiritual beacon, a city whose design and monuments reflected the deepest currents of Olmec cosmology. Unlike San Lorenzo's plateau, La Venta was carefully organized around Sacred Complex A, a ceremonial heart that orchestrated movement, sightlines, and ritual experience. At its center stood the Great Pyramid, a stepped earth and clay structure that, though modest in height compared to later Mesoamerican pyramids, projected authority, reverence, and permanence. From its terraces, priests and rulers could oversee the ceremonial plazas, observing both participants and the natural world in harmonious alignment. La Venta's plazas and platforms hosted offerings and processions that marked cycles of fertility, rain, and renewal. Large basalt altars, carved with transformation motifs, punctuated the sacred spaces, providing loci for ritual attention. Polished jade figurines, obsidian blades, and shells were carefully deposited as offerings, sometimes in caches within the pyramid or beneath ceremonial platforms. Each item acted as a link between human action and the divine, reflecting both spiritual care and social cohesion. The Great Pyramid itself was a stage of cosmic engagement. Its terraces likely guided processions, aligning movement with celestial and seasonal patterns. Though no texts survive to record the precise nature of these ceremonies, the arrangement of altars, plazas, and offerings suggests a deliberate choreography, where sacred space, ritual action, and communal attention intersected. The pyramid was both architectural achievement and spiritual instrument, a silent participant in Olmec religious life. Art and monumentality intertwined at La Venta. Colossal heads, smaller stele and basalt altars carried forward visual motifs established at San Lorenzo, while introducing innovations in scale, composition, and placement. Transformation figures, humans merging with jaguars or serpents, reinforced cosmological concepts, linking authority, fertility, and ritual practice. These images were not merely decorative. They served as guides, teaching viewers about sacred principles and social order through careful observation and reflection. One calm discovery of La Venta is the attention to materiality and symbolism. Basalt boulders were transported from distant Tuxtla Mountains, painstakingly carved, and positioned with precision. Jade objects traveled from Guatemala. Even humble offerings of shells or clay figurines were thoughtfully selected and arranged. This careful curation reflects a society attuned to both the physical and spiritual properties of objects, embedding meaning in every gesture, placement, and artifact. Life at La Venta unfolded around this sacred architecture. Artisans crafted and repaired ritual objects. Farmers and fishermen supplied the city with sustenance. And priests and leaders conducted ceremonies that both structured time and reinforced collective memory. The city's organization ensured that daily routines, labor, and worship were integrated, creating a rhythm that nurtured social cohesion, cultural identity, and spiritual continuity. La Venta's influence extended beyond its immediate environs. Trade networks facilitated the movement of jade, obsidian, and basalt, while ceremonial practices and iconography spread Olmec ideas across Mesoamerica. The city acted as both a spiritual hub and a cultural transmitter, ensuring that rituals, art, and social structures were observed, adapted, and remembered throughout the region. Even as La Venta flourished, it was built with an awareness of impermanence. Floods, environmental change, and gradual population shifts eventually led to decline. Yet the city's legacy persisted through its monuments, sacred spaces, and cultural imprint. Archaeologists today, uncovering buried caches and restored plazas, sense the quiet reverence of ancient participants, the hum of ceremonies, the careful placement of offerings, the measured gestures of priests and artisans. And still the story continued. As La Venta's prominence gradually waned, the Olmec heartland shifted once more, giving rise to centers like Tres Zapotes. Each site inherited traditions, symbols, and social innovations established in these earlier capitals, building a continuous lineage of Olmec civic and spiritual life. La Venta, with its sacred pyramid and meticulously arranged complexes, remains a testament to the Olmecs' ability to craft both physical and symbolic landscapes that harmonize daily life, ritual, and cosmic vision. What happens when a civilization becomes a tapestry of regions? By the later centuries of Olmec culture, the focus of activity shifted toward Tres Zapotes, a center that illustrates both continuity and diversity within the Olmec world. Nestled in low-lying plains, this city was less monumental than San Lorenzo or La Venta, yet it demonstrates a sophisticated adaptation to local geography, resources, and social dynamics. Its plazas, modest pyramids, and residential compounds reflect a blend of ceremonial tradition and practical settlement, emphasizing the flexibility and regional variation that characterized the Olmec civilization in its later phase. Tres Zapotes is perhaps most famous for Stela C, the earliest known long-count calendar date carved in Mesoamerica. This artifact, carved into basalt, marks a quiet but profound achievement, the Olmec's awareness of time, cycles, and continuity. Unlike the colossal heads of San Lorenzo or the Great Pyramid of La Venta, Stela C emphasizes abstract, conceptual mastery, a civilization contemplating chronology, memory, and the rhythm of generations. Its presence at Tres Zapotes highlights the enduring intellectual curiosity and ritual sophistication of the Olmecs. Life in and around Tres Zapotes blended ceremonial practice with daily rhythms. Artisans continued to carve figures, masks, and altars. Farmers and fishers maintained the fertility of floodplains, and traders facilitated connections with distant regions. The city's smaller scale did not diminish its cultural significance. Rather, it reveals how Olmec influence permeated multiple layers of society, accommodating local resources and social networks while maintaining ties to broader traditions. Regional diversity is evident in the material record. Basalt monuments, jade artifacts, and ceramic styles at Tres Zapotes show variations reflecting local tastes, ecological conditions, and evolving spiritual practices. Yet these regional adaptations did not fragment the Olmec identity. On the contrary, the interplay of local innovation and shared cultural symbols, jaguar motifs, transformation figures, ritual altars, allowed Olmec influence to remain cohesive across space and time. Communities learned to honor tradition while engaging their own surroundings creatively and respectfully. One calm discovery is the subtlety with which Tres Zapotes maintained links to prior capitals. Architectural layouts echoed ceremonial patterns established at San Lorenzo and La Venta, while iconography preserved key motifs. Offerings, burials, and ritual sequences suggest continuity in social and spiritual practice. Here, the Olmecs were not starting anew, but weaving past lessons into present needs, balancing heritage with adaptation to changing landscapes and communities. Trade and connectivity remained vital. Basalt from distant quarries, jade from southern regions, and tropical goods circulated through networks that connected trace supports to the broader Olmec heartland. These flows of material culture reinforced ideological continuity, allowing ideas, ritual practice, and artistic expression to transcend individual sites. Trace supports demonstrates that influence was not only about grandeur, but also about the persistence of cultural memory across multiple regions and scales. Daily life at trace supports mirrored this balance of ritual and routine. Residents attended local ceremonies, maintained fields and riverbanks, and crafted the objects that sustained both practical and spiritual life. The quieter pace of this city suggests a harmonious integration of work, devotion, and community, illustrating that Olmec civilization was as much about the rhythms of ordinary life as it was about monumental achievements. In observing these rhythms, one glimpses a civilization attentive to both the sacred and the everyday. Through trace supports, we also see the Olmec world expanding into a network of interconnected regions. Knowledge, art, and ritual traveled along rivers, roads, and exchange routes. Communities far from major capitals still participated in a shared cultural universe, blending local innovation with the broader visual, spiritual, and social vocabulary of the Olmecs. The civilization became a tapestry of regions, where each community contributed to a cohesive, enduring identity. Beyond these cities stretched a wide web of influence. From San Lorenzo's plateau to La Venta's sacred pyramid, and onward to Trace supports reflective spaces, the Olmec world encompassed a spectrum of settlements, each with its own character yet connected through shared symbols, ritual practices, and material culture. In these centers, the Olmecs demonstrated how a civilization could harmonize monumental vision, daily life, and regional diversity, leaving a legacy that would ripple across Mesoamerica for centuries to come. How far could ideas travel on footpaths alone? Long before roads were paved or empires codified their borders, the Olmecs forged connections across vast stretches of Mesoamerica. From the Pacific lowlands to the Caribbean coast, a network of trade routes threaded through rivers, valleys, and forests, carrying goods, ideas, and ritual knowledge. These paths were the arteries of early civilization, linking distant villages, ceremonial centers, and emerging cities into a coherent world of exchange. Material culture traveled along these routes. Jade from Guatemala, obsidian from the highlands, and basalt from the Tuxtla Mountains found their way into Olmec centers, often repurposed into ritual objects, ceremonial altars, or finely polished figurines. Rubber balls, used for ritual games, and colorful feathers from tropical birds also traversed these networks, illustrating the interplay of commerce, sport, and ceremony. Even the simplest shells, beads, and pigments became carriers of value and meaning, embodying both aesthetic and spiritual significance. The journey of goods was mirrored by the movement of ideas. Each trade interaction facilitated the transmission of iconography, ritual practice, and social customs. A jade figurine carved in one valley might inspire artistic motifs hundreds of kilometers away. Ceremonial protocols could adapt and spread as emissaries, traders, and pilgrims traveled. In this way, trade acted as a subtle yet powerful vector of cultural cohesion, allowing innovations, beliefs, and symbols to permeate a wide region without the use of coercion or conquest. One calm discovery lies in the rhythms of these exchanges. Caravans, rafts, and portages moved slowly, dictated by terrain, weather, and human endurance. Travelers and merchants needed patience, cooperation, and careful planning. Every step along a riverbank or mountain path was an act of connection, an opportunity to share knowledge, stories, and skills alongside material goods. Trade became a medium for observation and learning, enriching communities with practices and insights from beyond their immediate horizons. Daily life intersected with these networks in tangible ways. Craftsmen received raw materials, transforming them into culturally significant objects. farmers provided surplus to support traveling merchants, and communities prepared offerings, feasts, and ceremonial spaces for visiting emissaries. Trade was not simply economic, it was social, spiritual, and educational. Each exchange reinforced bonds, ensured continuity of ritual practice, and embedded collective memory into the fabric of everyday life. The geographical span of Olmec trade highlights their adaptability and understanding of diverse landscapes. Rivers carried canoes laden with precious goods. Overland routes crossed hills and valleys, connecting lowland forests with highland settlements. Strategic placement of centers like San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes enabled efficient participation in these networks, allowing the Olmecs to manage resources, distribute prestige items, and integrate distant communities into a shared cultural universe. Trade also preserved knowledge. Craft techniques, ceremonial instructions, and symbolic motifs traveled alongside jade, obsidian, and rubber. A single artifact could serve as both material and mnemonic device, reminding its possessor of distant regions, sacred traditions, or specialized skills. In this sense, the Olmecs were not merely merchants, they were custodians of information, transmitting culture through deliberate, patient human networks. Trade carried more than goods. With each journey, objects, rituals, and ideas intertwined, shaping the cognitive and spiritual landscapes of Mesoamerica. Pathways of exchange became conduits of innovation and continuity, preparing the way for later civilizations to inherit, adapt, and expand upon the Olmecs' quiet mastery of connectivity. Through these footpaths, rivers, and networks, the civilization extended its influence far beyond the horizon of any single city, demonstrating that culture, like water, moves gently yet persistently, shaping the land and the people it touches. Did the Olmecs write, and what remains of their words? Across the lowlands of Veracruz and Tabasco, among riverbanks and abandoned ceremonial grounds, archaeologists have uncovered signs of something remarkable. Symbols carved into stone, etched into jade, and arranged with deliberate care. They suggest intention, memory, language, and perhaps the earliest writing system in the Americas. For decades, scholars argued over whether the Olmecs left behind a script or simple imagery. But each new fragment, from portable celts to monumental carvings, deepens the sense that these were not random decorations. They belonged to a system of knowledge shared across centuries, tied to ritual, governance, astronomy, and timekeeping. These symbols form the quiet remains of a civilization thinking carefully about the world. The most striking evidence surfaced in 2006, when workers near the village of Cascajal found a rectangular stone slab carved with 62 distinct signs. Now known as the Cascajal block, it may represent the earliest known writing in Mesoamerica, dating to around 900 to 800 BCE. Unlike later Maya glyphs, the symbols here flow horizontally, arranged in lines with repeated patterns and mirrored forms that suggest grammatical structure. Some resemble insects or plants, others appear abstract. But together they hint at meaning, structured, intentional, and still undeciphered. Without longer texts or bilingual inscriptions, the script remains a mystery. Yet its very presence suggests that the Olmecs recorded rituals, names, offerings, or political events. Decoding it would open a window into one of the world's earliest intellectual traditions. Beyond the Cascajal block, recurring motifs appear across Olmec art. Maize sprouts rising from divine figures, jaguar human faces, crossband sky symbols, flame eyebrow deities, and the bar and dot patterns later used in numerical systems. These motifs were not writing in the strict sense, but they carried meaning shared, ritualized, and repeated across centuries. They reveal a culture communicating through images, linking religious ideas with material power. Some of these symbols spread far beyond the Olmec heartland. They appear in Zapotec pottery, Maya carvings, Teotihuacan murals, and Aztec codices. What began in the wetlands of Veracruz became a visual language that shaped Mesoamerican religion and kingship for 2,000 years. Hints of numerical and calendrical knowledge also emerge in the archaeological record. Though no complete calendar survives from the Olmec period, Many scholars believe that the 260-day ritual cycle, central to later Mesoamerican civilizations, originated here. Bar and dot notations, spatial alignments of ceremonial centers, and carved sequences on early monuments suggest that the Olmecs were exploring ideas of time, repetition, and cosmic order. They were not merely keeping track of days. They were measuring the sacred rhythms of the universe. Knowledge was also embedded directly into stone monuments. At La Venta, a ruler carved on altar for emerges from a niche that may reference lineage origins or mythic rebirth. At Tres Zapotes, Stela C preserves one of the earliest dates in the long count system, bridging the Olmec world with later Maya chronology. And the colossal heads, each with distinct headdresses, may represent named rulers, each commanding identity through stone rather than text. It is possible that writing in the Olmec world was restricted to elites, rulers, priests, astronomers, or ritual specialists who recorded only what needed to endure. When the institutions that supported them faded, the script may have been abandoned or transformed, leaving only scattered fragments for the future to decipher. Proto-writing systems are fragile. They depend on memory, authority, and continuity. When those break, silence follows. The Olmec script never blossomed into the elaborate glyphs of the Maya, yet its presence reveals that the foundations of Mesoamerican literacy, its symbols, its metaphors, its sacred numbers, were already forming centuries earlier than once believed. Even in silence, the Cascadal block continues to whisper across time. They also watched the sky. How did they watch the sky to understand the earth? In the lowland dawn, when mist rose from the wetlands and the first light touched the tops of ceiba trees, the Olmecs looked upward. To them, the sky was not distant, it was a living map, a guide, a rhythm that shaped the timing of maize, the flooding of rivers, the arrival of rain, and the quiet, repeating ceremonies that held their world together. Long before the great observatories of the Maya or the stone-lined sightlines of later cities, the Olmecs were watching the heavens carefully, patiently, and with a sense of reverence that fused nature and the divine. We cannot reconstruct their full astronomical system, but traces appear everywhere. In alignments of platforms, orientations of plazas, and the careful placement of stone monuments. These were not random choices. They reflect a people who believed that the cosmos and the earth breathed in tandem, and that understanding one meant understanding the other. Archaeologists have discovered that many early Mesoamerican sites, including those from the Olmec heartland, were oriented towards significant solar events. Some platforms at San Lorenzo align with sunrise positions at key points in the agricultural year. At La Venta, the entire ceremonial complex is rotated several degrees west of true north, a choice that may link to the setting sun on particular dates. Such alignments formed a subtle, monumental calendar, vast in scale, but grounded in close observation. The sky offered a language of cycles. The sun rose and fell. Venus brightened, vanished, then returned. Constellations drifted across the seasons. In this steady repetition, the Olmecs likely saw order, a promise that the world could be anticipated, guided, and reflected in ritual. Their priests, perhaps the earliest astronomer priests of Mesoamerica, learned when rains would come, when fields needed tending, and when ceremonies required renewal. By watching the heavens, they found the proper moments to ask the gods for balance. The roots of the 260-day sacred calendar may reach back to this early period. Although no surviving Olmec inscription records it explicitly, later civilizations across Mesoamerica shared the same interlocking cycles: the 260-day ritual count and the 365-day solar year. The widespread nature of these systems suggests a deep, ancient origin, perhaps beginning with the Olmecs themselves, who may have noticed symbolic coincidences between human gestation, maize cultivation, and celestial movements. Two cycles, one earthly, one cosmic, intertwined to create the sacred rhythms that later peoples would treat as the beating heart of time. Hints of numeracy appear in their art, bar and dot motifs, which would later become the core of Mesoamerican mathematics. These symbols appear on figurines, monuments, and even polished mirrors. They may have recorded quantities, days, or lineage sequences. Though silent now, they reflect an early attempt to measure, categorize, and place events within an ordered framework. Numbers were not only practical, they were sacred. Astronomy in the Olmec world was inseparable from spirituality. The night sky was imagined as a layered realm, a place of gods, ancestors, and forces that influenced the rains and the fertility of the earth. It was a landscape to be navigated not only with observation, but with ritual. Shamans, entering trance, may have envisioned themselves crossing the sky's boundary, traveling along the Milky Way or communing with celestial beings. To them, the stars were not just points of light. They were portals, pathways to understanding the hidden structure of reality. Certain animals, too, carried celestial meaning. The jaguar, a creature of night, may have been linked to darkness, storms, and the watery underworld. Birds, who soared toward the sun, served as messengers between realms. Serpents reflected the winding path of rivers and perhaps the motions of celestial bands. These creatures appear in Olmec art not as simple decoration, but as symbols of forces cycling through the world, echoing the rhythms of sky and earth. The ceremonial centers themselves may have acted as cosmic maps. At Venta, buried serpentine mosaics create stylized symbols that resemble cosmograms, rectangles and cruciform arrangements that mirror celestial order. They were carefully hidden beneath layers of clay, never meant to be seen again by human eyes. This suggests the ritual importance of establishing cosmic harmony in the very foundations of the city. Time, symmetry, and alignment were built directly into the ground. Some of the earliest stele carved centuries before later Mesoamerican civilizations developed full historical records, already hint at the idea of dating. Monumental sculptures depict rulers in poses that suggest events, perhaps ritual performances or inaugurations tied to specific moments in the calendar. While these are not explicit written dates, they represent an early sense that important events were anchored in time, bound to the cycles of sun and stars. Trace Zapotes provides one of the most profound clues. Stele C, carved long after the height of San Lorenzo and La Venta, bears an early long count date, one of the oldest known in Mesoamerica. Even though this monument belongs to a later phase sometimes called AP Olmec, it still shows the persistence of ideas originating centuries earlier in the Olmec world. Systems of counting days, structuring time, and marking historical moments did not materialize suddenly. They grew from these early experiments with calendars, alignments, and cosmic measurement. Through these fragments, we begin to see the outlines of an intellectual tradition, a civilization developing ways to measure the world, not with clocks or instruments, but with careful observation and ritualized understanding. Time was not simply kept, it was honored. The rising sun marked the beginning of cycles. The position of Venus might dictate the start of rituals. The turning of seasons shaped when fields were planted and when kings communed with the divine. Every movement in the sky signaled a movement in society. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of Olmec cosmology is its endurance. Thousands of years later, the Maya, Zapotec, Mixtec, and Aztec would refine and expand these systems. They developed complex calendars, astronomical tables, and monuments aligned precisely with solstices and equinoxes. Yet beneath all that sophistication lies an older foundation, a worldview seated along the rivers of the Gulf Coast, where early priests stood beneath a rising sun and sought meaning in its predictable return. Even without full texts or observatories, the Olmecs built a world in harmony with the cycles above them. They watched for patterns. They listened for signs. And they shaped their lives around the belief that the sky and the earth were parts of the same breath, moving in rhythm. But even stable worlds change. What happens when the land itself transforms? Along the Gulf Coast, where broad rivers once wound through wetlands and forests, the Olmec world unfolded in a landscape that was both generous and unpredictable. The land fed them. The rivers carried their canoes, watered their fields, and connected their centers in networks of exchange. Yet these same forces could shift without warning. Over centuries, the environment that had nurtured the first great Mesoamerican civilization slowly changed, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically reshaping the world the Olmecs depended on. The heartland of San Lorenzo and La Venta lay in a region dominated by rivers, the Coatzacoalcos, the San Juan, the Tonala, and countless smaller streams that braided the floodplains. These waterways were essential lifelines, offering fertile soil rich with silt and minerals. Seasonal flooding nourished the fields, and the wetlands teemed with fish, turtles, and edible plants. In this watery landscape, the Olmecs built their earliest centers, trusting that the land would continue to provide. But the earth is never still. Over the centuries, the river systems began to shift. Some gradually migrated away from established settlements, pulled by geological forces, sediment buildup, and the quiet reshaping of the terrain. Others changed their seasonal behavior, flooding more intensely in some years and failing to rise in others. For people who depended on predictable rhythms of water and land, even small changes could ripple through every aspect of life. At San Lorenzo, archaeological evidence shows signs of environmental stress during its later years. Sediment layers suggest heavier flooding and increased waterlogging across parts of the plateau and surrounding lowlands. These shifts likely affected agriculture, making some areas too wet to farm reliably while depriving others of the steady moisture they once enjoyed. Over time, the land that had supported a thriving center began to lose its stability, and the community would have faced the difficult task of adjusting planting strategies, relocating fields, and reshaping the landscape to preserve their way of life. Drought cycles also played their part. Paleoclimate studies across Mesoamerica point to periods of reduced rainfall during the mid-first millennium BCE. Even if these droughts were modest compared to later climatic events, they would have strained environments dependent on seasonal rains. Fields of maize, beans, and squash, the agricultural triad that later civilizations perfected, needed predictable moisture. If rains arrived late or fell unevenly, harvests could falter. And when harvests faltered, rituals intensified, communities reorganized, and leaders sought new ways to maintain balance between the human and divine worlds. The wetlands, too, transformed. Areas that once held shallow water for much of the year began to dry or shift, changing habitats for fish and animals. Places where Papaloapan River tributaries once fed quiet backwaters may have become unstable marsh or swamp. Ecological richness did not disappear, but it changed shape, demanding new strategies for fishing, hunting, and gathering. For a civilization attuned to the land, such shifts required constant adaptation. At the same time, geological uplift and subsidence slowly altered the elevations of key regions. In some areas, land rose slightly, causing rivers to carve new routes. In others, land sank, increasing flood risk. These transformations were too gradual to notice in a single lifetime but significant across centuries. Ceremonial complexes carefully aligned to cardinal directions or sacred landmarks might have become less accessible or less symbolic as waterways meandered to new courses. A city built to command a river might one day find that river drifting away, quietly undermining its economic and spiritual foundations. For the Olmecs, water was not just a resource. It was a living presence in their cosmology, tied to rain gods, fertility spirits, and the cycle of maize. When rivers behaved unpredictably, it may have felt as though cosmic balance itself was shifting. Rituals to restore harmony likely intensified. Offerings may have increased. Shamans and rulers would have sought signs and omens in the sky, the earth, and the behavior of animals. Environmental stress often deepened spiritual engagement, as communities searched for meaning in the rhythms of nature. Meanwhile, coastal changes affected trade. The Gulf shoreline has shifted significantly over millennia, and ancient estuaries may have transformed or silted over. Canoe routes that once linked inland centers to ocean trade could become clogged with sediment or forced into new channels, complicating the movement of goods like obsidian, jade, and cacao. The broader web that tied the Olmecs to distant regions, highlands, coasts, and river valleys, felt the subtle consequences of environmental change. These transformations did not cause immediate collapse. Olmec communities were resilient, skilled, and adaptive. They adjusted their agricultural systems, shifted settlements, and restructured local economies. Yet each change introduced new pressures, adding weight to a society already navigating internal complexities, growing populations, expanding ceremonial obligations, and the strain of sustaining monumental centers. Over time, the combined effects of shifting rivers, changing rainfall, and evolving landscapes began to erode the foundations of the oldest centers. San Lorenzo, already vulnerable to environmental instability, eventually declined, its population dispersing to newer areas with more reliable resources. Venta rose to prominence partly because it lay on more stable terrain, better positioned for trade and agriculture during a period of climatic variability. Even Venta, however, would eventually face its own challenges. Environmental changes continued through the centuries, altering coastlines, wetlands, and river systems that had long supported Olmec life. Each generation adapted, but the cumulative weight of these shifts gradually reshaped the cultural heartland. In the end, the land itself played a quiet, persistent role in the transformation of this remarkable civilization. Not through sudden catastrophe, but through steady natural change, erosion, flood, drought, sediment, and shifting water. The Olmecs lived within a dynamic landscape, and as it evolved, so too did their society. Communities adapted, yet pressures grew. Where do people go when their world becomes unstable? When rivers wandered from their ancient beds and the wetlands no longer behaved as they once had, the people of the Olmec heartland faced choices that echoed quietly through their daily lives. No single event forced them to move. Instead, it was a slow accumulation of subtle pressures. Fields that yielded less each year, floods that deepened, droughts that lingered, and sacred sites that no longer felt in harmony with the rhythms of the land. In such times, families and communities began to drift, seeking stability not in a distant exile, but in new landscapes shaped by different balances of water, soil, and stone. This gentle movement did not resemble the dramatic migrations of later ages. It unfolded gradually, across generations, guided by knowledge passed down through stories, by the memory of old paths, and by the quiet wisdom of elders who remembered how the land used to be. Some groups shifted only a short distance, relocating to higher rises within the floodplain or to newly forming ridges shaped by slow geological uplift. Others moved toward the foothills and low highlands to the west and south, where soils were still rich and water more predictable. In these upland zones, the environment felt different. The heavy humidity of the lowlands gave way to slightly cooler air, and the dense wetlands thinned into more varied ecosystems, oak and pine forests in some places, and drier savannas in others. Streams here were narrower, often seasonal, but less prone to overwhelming floods. For families accustomed to the vast, slow-moving rivers of the Gulf Coast, these landscapes offered new possibilities and challenges. Farming required different timing. Hunting and gathering shifted to new species. But stability, in many cases, felt more attainable. Archaeological traces mark this quiet movement. Sites once dense with occupation layers begin to thin, while small villages and hamlets appear farther inland, carrying with them the familiar shapes of Olmec pottery, jade ornaments, and ritual figurines. These were not refugees abandoning a collapsing world. They were farmers, artisans, and families seeking balance, choosing land that better supported their needs as conditions changed. Some groups followed long-used trade paths into regions that had always been loosely connected to the Olmec sphere. The Tuxtla Mountains, with their basalt outcrops and fertile volcanic soils, the uplands of Chiapas, rich in forest and wildlife, and the southern Veracruz interior, where river valleys created natural corridors. Along these routes, new communities emerged, small, resilient, and deeply tied to both old traditions and new realities. Over time, a gentle reorganization began to reshape the broader cultural landscape. The heartland did not empty, but its population became more spread out. Instead of a single dense core dominated by places like San Lorenzo and Venta, a constellation of smaller, regionally varied communities took shape. These settlements maintained connections through trade and shared beliefs, but their daily lives grew increasingly influenced by local conditions. In the highlands, people adapted their crops to different soils and rainfall patterns. In the low floodplain remnants, those who stayed relied more heavily on fishing, wetland plants, and shifting fields. Yet despite these changes, the memory of the old centers remained strong. People still traveled to them for ceremony, trade, or seasonal gatherings. Pilgrims may have visited sacred monuments long after the populations had dispersed, reaffirming bonds with ancestral places even as daily life gravitated elsewhere. Movement did not break their connection to the land, it transformed it. This period of reorganization also reshaped networks of exchange. Trade routes once anchored to San Lorenzo or La Venta began to diversify. Highland communities forged new links with neighboring regions, sharing obsidian, cacao, and crafted goods. The flow of jade from distant Guatemala persisted, but more intermediaries handled its passage. In this way, migration dispersed not only people, but also ideas, styles, and symbols, allowing the broader Olmec tradition to evolve and spread far beyond its original boundaries. The shifting geography of settlement may have influenced social structures as well. Smaller communities were less able to sustain large-scale labor projects, and monumental building slowed in some regions. Leadership may have become more localized, less tied to the grand ceremonies of the great centers and more adapted to the rhythms of smaller villages. Ritual specialists, once concentrated in powerful city temples, may have traveled more widely, serving multiple communities or establishing new ceremonial focal points in fresh landscapes. Even identity itself evolved. As groups adapted to different environments, they emphasized distinct local traditions, creating a tapestry of related yet unique expressions of Olmec culture. In the highlands, art might reflect mountain spirits and forest animals. In the wetlands, water creatures and river themes remained central. Across these differences, shared symbols, jaguars, maize, rain motifs, continued to unify them, but with regional accents shaped by the land they now called home. This reorganization was not a decline in a dramatic sense. It was an adaptation, a natural response to environmental shifts, economic pressures, and the quiet needs of everyday life. Civilization does not remain still. It breathes and adjusts, following the contours of the land and the choices of its people. In this sense, the Olmec world was not dissolving, but transforming into something more distributed, flexible, and regionally diverse. And even as people moved, they carried with them seeds, literal and symbolic, from their old homelands. Maize varieties adapted to different altitudes. Ceremonial practices adjusted to new landscapes. Stories anchored in the wetlands were retold in the hills, where they took on new shades of meaning. These small continuities ensured that, even as settlements shifted, the larger cultural identity endured. In the slow arc of generations, the Olmec world changed shape. The once concentrated heartland became a broader mosaic, stretching across highlands, lowlands, and interlocking river valleys. And with each new settlement came fresh responses to an ever-changing environment. Sacred landscapes changed too. What becomes of sacred places when the people move on? Across the Gulf Coast, the old ceremonial heartlands slowly grew quiet. The plazas that once echoed with festivals, with drumbeats rolling through humid air, began to gather silence instead. Travelers arriving from the highlands would have noticed subtle signs first. Offerings that had not been renewed, altars swept clean not for the next ceremony but because no ceremony was coming at all. The process was not abrupt. It unfolded the way twilight creeps across a familiar landscape, gradually, gently, but unmistakably. Archaeologists see these changes in the soil. At La Venta and other centers, the final offerings seem deliberate, almost ceremonial closures rather than abrupt abandonment. Buried caches were sealed as if the community were saying a careful farewell to its gods. Jade figurines, once arranged for ongoing rituals, were placed one last time with a sense of finality. The sacred fire was not extinguished in panic. It was allowed to burn down in a controlled, intentional way. Even the monumental art began to reflect this turning point. Colossal heads were left standing, still facing outward, but with no new sculptures replacing them. Basalt thrones, once carried great distances for rulers who mediated between the earthly and divine, were left unused. They did not break or vanish. They simply remained where they were, untouched, as though the people understood that their own story was shifting to another landscape. In some regions, the ritual focus lifted upward into the foothills. New centers appeared closer to fresh water sources and safer ground, places where trade routes could be re-established and communities reorganized. Ceremonies themselves changed. Instead of grand public events, rituals became smaller, more domestic, shaped by the needs of families rather than kings. The connection to the old sacred sites was not lost, only softened, remembered through stories, carried through objects, whispered through continuing traditions. The landscape absorbed these transitions. Temple mounds weathered gently, their edges softening beneath rain and wind. Altars that once marked offerings of cocoa, obsidian, and jade were gradually reclaimed by the forests. The spiritual geography shifted, yet the old centers remained powerful in memory. Even in decline, they held an aura, a sense that something important had happened here, something that shaped generations. These changes led toward an ending. Why do great centers grow quiet? In the humid lowlands of the Gulf Coast, the first signs were almost invisible. San Lorenzo, once the beating heart of an emerging civilization, began to lose its certainty. The great plateau that had been carved and reshaped by human hands for generations stood unchanged, but the energy that once radiated from its plazas slowly thinned. What had been a vibrant ceremonial hub grew subdued, its rhythm slipping out of sync with the world around it. Archaeologists trace this fading pulse through small, accumulating clues. Aqueducts that once carried water across the plateau show signs of repair delays. Workshops that produced the polished basalt monuments appear to slow in output. Even the patterns of discarded pottery shift, suggesting fewer people, fewer gatherings, fewer rituals anchoring the community together. Nothing catastrophic appears to have struck San Lorenzo in a single blow. Instead, the decline seems to have been a tide that turned slowly, a gradual ebbing of influence as environmental pressures and shifting alliances reshaped the region. Some scholars point to the changing rivers. The Quetzalcoatlus, always unpredictable, may have altered course, leaving parts of the surrounding landscape less fertile or more difficult to navigate. Others see hints of political realignment. Ambitious local elites rising in secondary centers, drawing pilgrimage, trade, and authority away from the old capital. Still others suggest that as populations grew and dispersed, the tightly organized system San Lorenzo once commanded simply became harder to maintain. Farther east, Venta rose as San Lorenzo faded. For a time, it seemed that the Olmec world was preparing for a new chapter, a new ceremonial core, a new place where rulers could speak for gods and ancestors. And indeed, Venta flourished. Its pyramids soared above the wetlands, its massive mosaic pavements gleamed with deliberate geometry, and its sculptors produced some of the most iconic Olmec art ever carved. But even here, the height of power did not last. By the end of the first millennium BCE, the same signs of dimming appear. Construction slows. Offerings become less frequent. The monumental heart of Venta begins to fracture. Not in a single moment but through a drawn-out unraveling that feels almost ritual in itself. The final offerings buried beneath the plazas suggest a conscious farewell, as though the people understood that their sacred center had completed its purpose, and that the world was shifting beneath their feet. Climate instability may have played a part. Periods of intense flooding followed by drought placed enormous stress on communities built around wetlands. Agricultural fields could alternate between being washed out and drying into cracked earth. Trade networks across Mesoamerica fluctuated, too. New powers were emerging in the highlands and along the Pacific coast, creating a landscape where influence was constantly renegotiated. And with these pressures, the great centers grew quieter. Not empty, not abandoned in a single breath, but less central, less certain, less alive with the rituals that had once defined Olmec identity. Families moved to higher ground. Priests carried sacred objects away from temples that would no longer be maintained. Sculptures were left standing in place, their faces still watchful, but their audiences dispersed across new settlements. In the end, San Lorenzo and La Venta did not fall through conquest or collapse in the dramatic sense. They faded slowly, steadily, like the last embers of a long-burning fire. Their influence scattered across the region, carried by people who kept fragments of tradition alive even as they built new homes and shaped new cultural identities. Yet decline did not mean disappearance. What remains after the center no longer holds. In the wake of San Lorenzo and La Venta's fading influence, the world they had shaped did not collapse into silence. Instead, it fractured gently, like a vessel that had been placed under steady pressure for too long. The pieces did not scatter at random. They carried with them the memory of the whole. Communities across the Gulf lowlands, the Tuxtla Mountains, and the rising highland valleys continued to live, trade, create, and believe, even as the unified ceremonial core that had once guided them dissolved into a constellation of smaller traditions. The archaeological record shows this transformation with remarkable clarity. In sites that once took cues from the grand centers, local styles began to diverge. The immense basalt heads, unmistakably tied to the political power of the early Olmec rulers, no longer appear, but their spirit lingers in new forms of leadership and imagery crafted in clay, sandstone, and jade. Political authority became more regional, more varied, shaped by the needs of smaller, more independent communities. Where once there had been a single heartland, many distinct voices now rose. In the Tuxtla foothills, artisans continued carving figurines with expressive faces and intricate headdresses, echoing but not replicating the old motifs. Inland, along the river corridors that connected the Gulf Coast to the highlands, pottery styles shifted to incorporate new influences, blending legacy Olmec geometries with innovations spreading from central Mexico. Even the patterns of settlement changed. Instead of great capitals rising above the wetlands, clusters of villages and modest ceremonial platforms supported more localized rituals and seasonal gatherings. Scholars sometimes describe this period as AP Olmec, a term meant to capture what persisted after the height of La Venta. Not a new civilization, not simply a remnant, but a transitional world. One of the clearest windows into this era is found at Tres Zapotes, which continued to thrive long after the earlier centers dimmed. Here, local leaders developed their own sculptural traditions and political symbols, distinct yet still carrying echoes of the Olmec past. Stela C, with its long count date, is among the most striking examples, hinting at an evolving priesthood and emerging systems of timekeeping that would one day shape Mesoamerica more broadly. But fragmentation was not only political or artistic, it was spiritual. The grand rituals that once united thousands under the shadow of colossal heads transformed into ceremonies rooted in community identity rather than regional power. Offerings grew smaller, more personal. Sacred landscapes became tied to local mountains, springs, and groves rather than distant capitals. The gods themselves may have shifted, no longer bound to singular monumental centers but appearing in regional variants adapted to different environments and cultural needs. And yet, despite this decentralization, there was continuity. Certain symbols, the were-jaguar, the cleft-headed infant, the flame-browed deity, did not disappear. They evolved. They became part of a broader Mesoamerican visual language, one that would thread through the art of the Maya, the Zapotecs, the Mixtecs, and later the peoples of central Mexico. The Olmec legacy, no longer anchored to a specific city, traveled through memory, craft, belief, and trade. This diffusion carried their ideas far beyond the old swamps and river channels of the Gulf Coast. The jade routes stretching toward Chiapas and Guatemala remained active, and through them, motifs and ritual practices found new homes. Highland communities began incorporating lowland symbols into their own religious architecture. Even in distant regions, echoes of the Olmec worldview appear. In masks, in figurines, in the shared language of power and sacred transformation. Some of the most intriguing developments of this era arise not from continuity but from adaptation. As new political centers emerged elsewhere in Mesoamerica, they absorbed and reshaped the visual grammar of the Olmec world into something distinct. This was not imitation but reinterpretation. a process through which younger cultures acknowledged the prestige of the old while forging identities suited to their own landscapes and ambitions. Thus, the Olmec became both ancestor and influence, a presence woven into the foundations of later civilizations. In many ways, fragmentation marked the transition from an age defined by a few powerful centers to a mosaic of interconnected societies. Each fragment held within it a portion of what came before: the techniques of sculpting stone, the choreography of ritual, the knowledge of celestial cycles, the sensibility of mythic transformation. The story of the Olmec did not end with the quieting of their capitals. It spread outward, softened into 1,000 variations, and settled into the cultural bedrock of Mesoamerica. By the final centuries of the first millennium BCE, the old heartland no longer commanded the region. But its imprint endured, not in empire, not in monuments rising from swamp and riverbank, but in memory, in symbols passed from hand to hand, in traditions that survived precisely because they adapted to new circumstances. From these fragments, new worlds emerged. How does a civilization live on after its cities fall silent? Long after the colossal heads were no longer raised and the great ceremonial platforms of San Lorenzo and La Venta slipped quietly beneath layers of earth, the essence of the Olmec world continued to move through Mesoamerica like a soft undercurrent. Civilizations rise and fall, but ideas, especially the ones tied to sacred time, ritual power, and the shaping of stone, have a way of outliving their makers. The Olmecs, often called the mother culture, did not vanish, they diffused. They became a memory that other peoples carried forward, adapting fragments of an older vision into new landscapes, new temples, and new stories. One of the clearest places to see this continuity is in the early Maya world. In the humid lowlands of Chiapas and Guatemala, where the first Maya centers emerged, archaeologists have uncovered monuments and iconography that blend local creativity with unmistakable Gulf Coast elements. At sites like Tacalacabaj and Izapa, curving mouth motifs, flame-like brows, and jaguar attributes recall the figures carved centuries earlier at La Venta. These were not simple borrowings but meaningful incorporations, symbols taken up by emerging Maya elites as they defined authority, lineage, and sacred legitimacy. Even the Maya calendar, one of the hallmarks of their intellectual achievement, may carry deep roots stretching back toward the Olmec horizon. While the full system blossomed under Maya astronomer priests, early forms of daykeeping and cosmic order appear in the AP Olmec script of Tres Zapotes and La Majara. The long count date on Stela C, quiet, unadorned, yet monumental in its implications, suggests that the basic scaffolding of Mesoamerican time was already taking shape in the centuries after Olmec political decline. The Maya did not inherit a finished system. They inherited a conceptual spark. To the west, in the valleys of Oaxaca, the Zapotec civilization was beginning its long ascent. Here, too, echoes of Olmec influence surface in early temple design, ceramic figures, and symbolic motifs. At Monte Alban, the earliest phases show a blending of local and lowland traditions, downturned mouths, feline traits, and the use of carved stelae to express political power. The Zapotec people adapted these elements to their rugged highland environment, reshaping the visual language of rulership and ritual to suit their own cosmology. Over time, they developed a script, built expansive terrace cities, and emerged as a major force. Yet the imprint of early Gulf Coast iconography remains visible in those first, formative centuries. Beyond these major centers, the Olmec legacy traveled quietly along trade routes and through ritual exchange. In central Mexico, at sites like Tlatilco and Tlapacoya, artisans produced figurines with expressive faces and symbolic poses reminiscent of older Gulf Coast styles. Some may have been inspired by travelers, merchants, or ritual specialists moving between regions. Others may reflect the natural tendency of ideas to migrate across boundaries wherever people meet. Even in areas that never fell under Olmec political influence, motifs like cleft-head infants, were-jaguar traits, and maze-related deities appear in ways that hint at long-distance contact or shared conceptual worlds. The continuity is not only artistic, it is cosmological. Many features that would later define Mesoamerican religion appear first in the Olmec world. The sacred mountain, the world tree, the tri-layered cosmos of sky, earth, and watery underworld. These ideas became foundational, shaping the Maya understanding of creation, the Zapotec rituals of ancestral communion, and the Pan-Mesoamerican emphasis on agricultural renewal and cyclical time. The Olmecs created no empire, left behind no written doctrine, and forged no lasting political unity. Yet their worldview quietly set the stage for civilizations that would eclipse them in scale and complexity. One of the most intriguing ways this legacy survived is through materials. Jade, once carried from distant Motagua River quarries to the workshops of San Lorenzo and La Venta, continued to hold spiritual and social value across Mesoamerica for millennia. Maya lords wore jade masks and pectorals not merely because of their beauty, but because jade had become a symbol of life force and renewal, meanings already well established in Olmec times. Similarly, the rubber balls used in the Mesoamerican ballgame, a tradition the Olmecs helped shape, became integral to Maya and Central Mexican religious ceremonies. The game's role as a cosmic drama, reenacting the struggle between light and darkness, has deep roots that extend back into the Olmec imagination. In the highland Mixtec and later Mexica Aztec worlds, the Olmec presence is more subtle yet still perceptible. Mythic stories of ancient, powerful peoples who lived near swamps and rivers, who could transform into jaguars, who carved great stones and communed with spirits, appear scattered across oral traditions and later codices. These tales may not name the Olmecs directly, but they preserve an ancestral memory, a sense that the earliest peoples to shape Mesoamerica possessed a closeness to the sacred that later civilizations respected and sometimes feared. Even the very idea of sacred rulership, that leaders mediated between worlds, drawing power from divine ancestors, resonates across centuries. Olmec rulers portrayed themselves as part human, part supernatural, emerging from caves or seated upon thrones representing portals to the underworld. Maya kings would later do the same, standing atop pyramids aligned to celestial events, wearing masks of gods and reenacting mythic journeys through darkness and rebirth. The continuity is not literal. It is conceptual, woven through shared understandings of what it meant to hold power in a world alive with spirits. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Olmecs lies in their role as cultural catalysts. They did not merely pass down symbols or techniques. They helped set in motion a pattern of innovation that defined Mesoamerica for 2,000 years. Their approach to monumental art, sacred space, narrative imagery, and cosmic order encouraged later societies to think in long timelines and layered stories, to build cities that were not only places of governance, but mirrors of the universe. In this way, the Olmecs lived on not through direct descendants but through influence, a quiet, persistent current moving beneath the surface of later civilizations. They became part of the deep substratum of Mesoamerican identity, a foundation upon which the Maya, Zapotec, Mixtec, and countless others built worlds of astonishing creativity and complexity. And so we arrive at our final reflection. What ideas traveled farther than the Olmecs themselves? Long after the last great mound at La Venta was abandoned and the quiet forests closed over the plazas of San Lorenzo, the ideas born in the Olmec heartland began to move in widening circles. They traveled not through armies or conquests but through memory, ritual, exchange, and the steady motion of people carrying their traditions from one generation to the next. The Olmecs may never have ruled a vast empire, yet their worldview, their symbols, their sacred landscapes, their sense of cosmic order, seeped into the cultural fabric of Mesoamerica in ways that shaped civilizations for millennia. This influence often began with image and symbol. The curving mouths, downturned jaguar features, flame-like eyebrows, and infantile deity forms that first appeared in Gulf Coast art became archetypes repeated across distant regions. At Izapa and Tocalacabaj, emerging Maya artists carved stele with motifs clearly rooted in earlier Olmec thought. In the Oaxaca Valley, early Zapotec carvers incorporated feline elements and supernatural hybrids into their own visual language. These were not copied blindly. They were interpreted, reshaped, and woven into new cultural contexts. Yet behind them all lies a faint echo, a stylistic memory of the people who carved the first colossal heads. Beyond art, the Olmecs helped establish the deep intellectual traditions of Mesoamerica. Ideas about sacred rulership, the notion that a leader mediated between worlds, spread widely. In the centuries after the Olmec age, Maya kings took up this model, performing rituals atop pyramids aligned with celestial bodies, dressed in regalia that blended myth and ancestry. The Zapotecs, Mixtecs, and even the later Mexica adopted similar structures of sacred authority. Though each culture adapted the concept to its own needs, the underlying belief that rulers embodied the cosmic balance resonates strongly with Olmec precedents. Time itself shows signs of Olmec influence. The earliest hints of Mesoamerican calendrics, the ordered cycles, the structuring of ritual days, the recognition of cosmic rhythms, appear in the Olmec culture of Tres Zapotes. The long count date on Stela C, unmistakably ancient and quietly revolutionary, suggests that the Olmecs or their successors laid down the conceptual groundwork for the sophisticated timekeeping systems that the Maya would later refine. These were not simple numeric systems but cosmological frameworks, binding the movements of stars and seasons to the rhythm of human life. Spiritual concepts travel just as far. The sacred mountain, the world tree, the layered universe of sky, earth, and underworld, all appear in later Mesoamerican mythologies. The Olmec vision of a cosmos where humans, animals, and spirits intersected through caves, springs, and mountaintops found new interpretations in Maya glyphs, Zapotec rituals, and Aztec ceremonial calendars. Even the practice of using jade as a symbol of life force and renewal spread widely, becoming one of the most enduring shared materials of the region. A jade mask buried in a Maya tomb carries within it centuries of memory, reaching back to hands that carved green stone on the Gulf Coast long before. The Mesoamerican ball game, too, bears Olmec fingerprints. The earliest rubber balls and court markers suggest that the Olmecs helped formalize a ritual sport that would become central to religion, politics, and mythology across the continent. For the Maya and Aztec, the game represented cosmic struggle, light against darkness, order against chaos, themes that align deeply with Olmec depictions of transformation, power, and spiritual conflict. Trade networks helped carry these ideas into new regions. Merchants traveling between highlands and lowlands shared goods, but also stories and rituals. Obsidian, jade, cacao, feathers, and fine ceramics moved in one direction. Symbols, myths, and sacred concepts moved in another. Communities as far as central Mexico show traces of Olmec aesthetic influence, despite never falling within the Olmec heartland's political orbit. This suggests not domination, but admiration. Smaller communities adopting elements of a culture they viewed as ancient, powerful, and spiritually potent. Even in places where direct Olmec contact is unlikely, fragments of their worldview survive. Codices from later periods describe ancient peoples of the swamps and lowlands who mingled with jaguars and communed with spirits. These memories, though transformed by centuries of retelling, capture something essential. A recognition that the earliest monumental civilization of Mesoamerica possessed a deep spiritual authority that later cultures revered, sometimes feared, and often sought to emulate. And in this way, the Olmecs became more than a historical culture. They became a foundation. Their ideas continued to move quietly beneath the surface of Mesoamerican life, shaping architecture, belief systems, rulership, and cosmic understanding. They became the deep root from which later worlds grew, visible not in direct continuity, but in patterns, symbols, and stories repeated across centuries. Their rediscovery came much later. How do we reconstruct a world without written chronicles? In the absence of surviving books, letters, or royal inscriptions, archaeologists have become the primary storytellers of the Olmec world. Their work unfolds slowly, layer by layer, through the careful study of soil, stone, and ancient refuse. Every potsherd, every fragment of jade, every abandoned hearth becomes a clue, a quiet voice from a time when history was not recorded in words but lived through rituals, landscapes, and memory. Reconstructing this world is an act of patience and humility, a practice of listening to what the earth has preserved. The modern Olmec story begins not with ancient discoveries, but with 19th-century eyes noticing something unusual. Travelers in the Gulf Coast noted giant stone heads half buried in sugarcane fields, their features unlike anything seen in Maya or Aztec art. Early scholars struggled to understand them, unsure whether they represented an unknown culture or a strange offshoot of more famous civilizations. It would take decades before the idea of an Olmec civilization emerged, a culture older than the Maya, predating Teotihuacan, and shaping the very foundations of Mesoamerican thought. As archaeological methods improved, so did the picture. Excavations at Tres Zapotes in the 1930s uncovered monumental sculpture and, more importantly, fragments of stela C, carrying a long count date older than any then known from the Maya world. This discovery shifted the timeline of Mesoamerican intellectual history and suggested that the roots of calendrical thought went deeper than anyone had realized. Soon after, systematic research at San Lorenzo and La Venta revealed engineered plateaus, colossal heads, workshops, and offerings buried in patterned layers of colored clays. These were not the works of a minor culture but the remnants of a sophisticated civilization. Archaeology brought to light the complexity of their cities. At San Lorenzo, researchers discovered a series of stone drains, channels carved from basalt, forming networks that helped manage water on the plateau. These features speak of planning, engineering knowledge, and the cooperation of hundreds of workers. Nearby workshops revealed broken monuments and basalt flakes, showing how artisans shaped massive stones with stone tools alone. Each discovery expanded our understanding of how the Olmecs lived, worked, and envisioned their world. Sites at La Venta provided a different perspective, one of ritual, cosmology, and ceremonial grandeur. The massive Great Pyramid, rising like an earthen mountain, aligned with plazas and mounded structures arranged on a north-south axis. Hidden beneath these surfaces were some of the most extraordinary offerings in Mesoamerica: mosaics of serpentine blocks forming abstract designs, lines of jade celts arranged like rays of emerging light, and figurines placed in carefully staged miniature scenes before being buried forever. These caches were not meant to be seen again. They were acts of devotion, expressions of a worldview in which the earth itself was a living participant in ritual. Through such finds, archaeologists began piecing together the invisible aspects of culture: social organization, religion, and power. For example, the distribution of luxury goods at San Lorenzo, jade, iron or mirrors, fine ceramics, suggests a society with distinct ranks and regional connections. Meanwhile, chemical analyses of clay and stone link Olmec workshops to distant sources, helping reconstruct trade routes that tied the coast to the highlands. In the absence of written records, such scientific techniques serve as new forms of translation, turning the chemistry of objects into stories of movement and exchange. Dating technologies have played a major role as well. Radiocarbon samples from charcoal, seeds, and construction layers allow archaeologists to map the rise and fall of centers with increasing precision. Through these timelines, we see how San Lorenzo flourished early, how La Venta reached its height as San Lorenzo declined, and how Tres Zapotes bridged the transition to later cultures. This temporal clarity helps us understand not just what the Olmecs created, but when and how their ideas changed over generations. The modern Olmec story has also broadened geographically. Excavations in Guerrero, Puebla, Morelos, and western Mexico have uncovered Olmec-style artifacts far from the Gulf Coast, suggesting a complex network of influence. Yet archaeologists now caution against assuming that all such artifacts mean direct Olmec control. Some regions adopted Olmec imagery because they admired it. Others produced local variations. The archaeological challenge lies in distinguishing between true cultural exchange and the widespread appeal of a powerful artistic style. Interpretation remains an evolving process. Scholars once imagined the Olmecs as a singular mother culture from which all others sprang. Today, the view is more nuanced. The Olmecs were part of a tapestry of interacting societies, sharing ideas while nurturing innovations of their own. Archaeology shows that Mesoamerica was never static. Communities experimented, adopted, adapted, and sometimes resisted influences. In this broader landscape, the Olmecs stand out not because they dominated others, but because their symbols and worldview resonated across regions and centuries. Perhaps the most humbling aspect of modern Olmec archaeology is its recognition of how much remains unseen. Dense forests, shifting rivers, and centuries of erosion have hidden countless sites. Some lie beneath farmland, others beneath modern towns. Remote sensing technologies, LiDAR and ground-penetrating radar, are beginning to reveal mounds, terraces, and forgotten structures beneath the canopy, offering new glimpses of settlements once thought lost. Each discovery reminds us that our understanding is still incomplete, still growing, still sensitive to the land's ability to hold secrets. In the end, reconstructing the Olmec world is both a scientific endeavor and an imaginative one. Archaeologists piece together fragments, but listeners and readers help breathe life into them. A miniature jade figure becomes a moment of ritual. A basalt drain becomes a trace of engineering genius. A buried mosaic becomes a spiritual offering to forces understood only through silence. Through this interplay of evidence and insight, the Olmecs emerge not as shadows, but as people, farmers, rulers, artisans, and pilgrims, shaping a world whose echoes remain. Yet their deepest legacy is quieter still. When we close our eyes and imagine Mesoamerica's beginnings, what gentle echoes of the Olmecs still whisper across the jungles. Long after their cities softened into earth and their monuments settled into silence, something of the Olmecs lingers, not as a sharp memory, but as a quiet presence woven into the land itself. In the stillness of the Gulf Coast lowlands, where mist gathers over rivers at dawn, one can almost feel the pulse of that first civilization. It comes to us not through written chronicles but in the texture of the earth, in the contours of ancient mounds, in the calm persistence of stories shaped by time. What remains is less a tale of rulers and dates, and more a whisper of origins, the enduring sense that this is where so much began. To stand before a colossal head today is to feel an unexpected softness of emotion. Their features, though carved from basalt, appear gentle, introspective, almost meditative. The helmets that crown them speak of rituals now forgotten, and their downturned lips suggest a thoughtfulness that transcends millennia. These stone faces remind us that the beginning of civilization in this region was not solely defined by conquest or authority, but also by reflection, cosmology, and a deep engagement with the forces of nature. They serve as anchors in the landscape, keeping the memory of a people who shaped their world with care. In the quiet moments of an evening, when the sun sinks low and the forests hum softly with insects, it is easy to imagine how the Olmecs experienced this same serenity. They lived between rivers that shifted like living beings, beneath skies that carried stories in their stars, and within forests alive with jaguars, birds, and the steady cycles of growth and decay. Their cosmology did not separate the sacred from the everyday. Rather, divinity was felt in the river's bend, in the rhythm of planting and harvest, in the echo of a drum carrying through a ceremonial plaza. This seamless blending of life and spirit remains one of their greatest legacies. Their influence, too, endures subtly. Later civilizations, the Maya, Zapotec, Mixtec, and others, carried forward fragments of Olmec thought. The reverence for jade, the sacred ballgame, the commitment to monumental architecture, and perhaps the earliest steps toward organized writing and measured time. These were not merely cultural borrowings, but the continuation of a worldview that saw humanity as part of a greater cosmic pattern. Even as distinct societies formed their own identities, the foundational ideas seeded by the Olmecs remained embedded in the Mesoamerican imagination. Yet a calm farewell to this civilization requires acknowledging what we cannot know. So much of their story rests beneath layers of earth, hidden by rivers that have changed course and forests that have reclaimed their ground. We piece together their world from fragments. A figurine here, a jade bead there, the curve of a buried platform uncovered by chance or careful excavation. This uncertainty is not a barrier, but a kind of gentle invitation. It reminds us that the past is not a fixed narrative but an ongoing discovery, one that asks us to listen patiently to the land, to the artifacts, and to the silence that fills the spaces in between. Perhaps what touches us most is the humanity that emerges from these remnants. The Olmecs were farmers rising before dawn to tend maize fields shimmering with dew. They were artisans who shaped jade into forms that captured moments of belief and devotion. They were rulers who sat upon stone thrones carved to resemble cave mouths, thresholds between worlds. They were children who learned to walk on packed earth courtyards, tracing patterns in dust beneath the watchful gaze of ceremonial mounds. In recognizing these lives, we come closer to understanding that civilizations begin not with monuments, but with the steady heartbeat of communities. And so, our farewell is not a closing of a door, but a gentle dimming of the light, an invitation to appreciate the shadows that remain. The Olmecs continue to exist in the imagination, in the calm geometry of their art, in the quiet intelligence of their engineering, and in the enduring sense that the land they shaped still holds their memory. Their story teaches us that the foundations of civilization can be peaceful, rooted in observation, relationship, and the belief that the world is deeply alive. As we let their story settle, we return to the present with a softened awareness. The rivers still flow toward the sea, though their paths are different now. The forests still breathe in slow, ancient rhythms. And somewhere beneath the soil, the last traces of Olmec footsteps linger, indistinguishable yet undeniably real. And so we close this long journey, not with an ending, but with a quiet breath. The Olmecs do not vanish. They fade gently into the background of time, becoming part of the deep hum of history that surrounds us. Their legacy is not loud. It is a whisper carried by wind over forgotten mounds, a feeling that the beginnings of things are always close, always waiting to be rediscovered. And with that quiet echo, their world, and ours, meets softly in the dusk. If you enjoyed this quiet journey into the world of the Olmecs, consider staying with us a little longer. There are many more civilizations, myths, and forgotten ages waiting in the dark. If you'd like to travel with us again, you can subscribe or simply let the next story begin on its own. Thank you for joining me tonight. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next chapter of history.